I went camping by the river because I needed a break from everything. Work had been eating up my time, and the city was getting too loud. I wanted silence. I wanted trees, water, and just the sound of insects in the wind. I found a spot online. Some guy had posted a photo of his tent right by the water, framed by thick pines and a clear sky. He said he had to hike in, maybe 2 hours through unmanaged trails, but that was worth it. That was all I needed. I packed light, but enough: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, freeze-dried meals, my knife, and a map of the area. No cell signal there, so I marked my route and gave a copy to my cousin in case something happened. I left my car in a pull-off where the Forest Service gate blocked vehicles from going deeper. I started walking mid-morning. The trail was faint, mostly deer paths and not official, but I followed the river downstream. The further I went, the quieter it got. I didn't see anyone, just some old rusted cans near a fallen tree early on, maybe from other campers, but they were weathered and probably years old. By the afternoon, I found the spot. It was perfect, a flat patch of grass about 10 feet from the riverbank. A slow bend in the river gave a good view upstream and downstream. Trees surrounded the clearing, but they weren't so thick that I felt boxed in. The sun came through in beams. I set up my tent and boiled water for dinner. The smell of pine and river water mixed with the food, and I felt relaxed for the first time in weeks. I slept early, just listening to frogs and insects and the distant gurgle of the current. The next morning, I got up with the light. I had oatmeal and coffee. I decided to explore along the river, maybe look for animal tracks or a better fishing spot. I walked downstream this time, maybe a mile, weaving through brush and stepping over fallen branches. That's when I saw the first snare. At first, I didn't even recognize it. It was so thin. Just a wire loop on the ground, held open with a bent branch. Then I saw the little stakes in the dirt, the trigger mechanism. It was set right beside a small game trail that came out of the woods. Whoever made it knew what they were doing. It was active, too. The wire wasn't rusted. No leaves caught in it. It had been checked recently. I looked around. Nothing but trees. I moved slowly and kept walking. After a few more minutes, I found another one. Then another, all along the trail, hidden under leaves or propped between roots. These weren't decorative or abandoned. They were part of an active line. I crouched beside one and looked at how it was made. Whoever set it up had experience. Twists on the wire were clean, tension was right. It wasn't amateur work. I felt strange suddenly, like I was in a place I wasn't supposed to be. I turned around and headed back. The air felt heavier. I stopped a few times to listen, thinking I heard branches moving. But it could have been anything: birds, squirrels. Still, I moved quicker. When I got back to camp, everything was as I left it. Tent was untouched, stove folded and packed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I spent the rest of the day near my tent, reading and resting. I didn't go exploring again. That night, I had a hard time sleeping. I kept hearing twigs snap. Once, I sat up in the tent and waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no lights. Just a river. I told myself it was animals again. Raccoons, maybe deer. Still, I kept my knife close. The next morning, I decided I'd leave early. I packed up camp fast, barely ate. I was just getting my stuff together when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from a low branch, maybe 30 feet from my tent, was a rabbit, dead. Its neck was crushed. It had been snared. Blood soaked its fur and had dripped onto the leaves below. It hadn't been there yesterday. I would have seen it. It wasn't tossed or forgotten. It was placed, right in view, like a warning. I didn't think. I just hoisted my pack, tightened the straps, and started walking fast the way I came. The trail felt different now. Every sound made me turn my head. I kept imagining someone walking behind me, just out of sight. I kept checking over my shoulder. Maybe a half hour from the car, I noticed something new. Boot prints. Not mine. Bigger. Deeper. They hadn't been there on the hike in, and they followed the same trail I was on. At one point, they veered off toward the river. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know. When I reached the road where I'd left the car, I almost cried. But then I saw the back hatch was open. I hadn't left it that way. I moved slow. Nothing inside looked taken. But my map was gone. The one I left in the glove compartment with my notes on where I'd camped. My backup lighter was missing too. Everything else, food, tarp, first aid kit, was still there. It didn't make sense. I got in and drove fast, bouncing over potholes until I hit the highway. Only when I was 30 miles away did I stop at a gas station. I went inside to clean up, grab food, and breathe. I didn't report it. What would I say? That someone set traps and didn't want me near them? That they left a rabbit for me to find and took a map from my car? None of it was illegal on its own. I hadn't seen a person, hadn't been hurt, but I knew what I felt. For weeks after, I kept checking my car, watching behind me when I walked alone, locking my doors twice. Nothing else happened. No one followed me. No one broke into my place. Still, I kept thinking about those snares. They weren't for show. Someone maintained them. Someone lived out there, or checked that stretch of forest often. And whoever it was didn't want company. They didn't leave a note or scare me off with a loud warning. They left a body, a dead rabbit, hung low enough for me to see, but high enough to feel like a message. That kind of thing stays with you. Not because it's loud or violent. Because it's careful, measured, like they'd done it before. I haven't been back to that river. I still camp, but never without telling someone exactly where I'm going and never off trail anymore. If I see a snare, I turn around. I don't look closer. I don't touch it. Because some people don't need fences to mark their land. Just a wire, a rabbit, and silence. It started with a simple plan, a weekend away from everything. No emails, no buzzing phone, no city noise, no people. Just a tent, a fire, and the river. I had camped before, plenty of times, but something about this trip felt different even before I left. Not wrong, just quieter, like I was walking into something still and untouched. I chose a spot along a river bend I'd seen a few months back during a hike. Wide water, slow current, tree line curved like a cradle. There was a small open space on the bank, soft grass, and just enough room to pitch a one-man tent. I parked about half a mile out and hiked in. The path was narrow, barely more than a deer trail, and the summer heat soaked through my shirt within minutes. My boots thudded on the ground, the only real sound besides the bugs and birds. I liked that. Everything felt far away. When I got to the site, it looked even better than I remembered. The slope of the bank wasn't steep, maybe 4 or 5 feet above the water, and the grass grew thick right to the edge. I could tell from the faint depressions in the ground that other campers had used it, though it didn't seem recent. I dropped my pack, stretched out my shoulders, and looked at the river. The water moved slow, dark and glassy, bending away to the left and disappearing into trees. I saw no trash, no footprints. It felt like mine. I spent the next hour clearing a little more space and pitching the tent. I had a lightweight 3 Season 1, green and gray, low to the ground. I made sure to drive the stakes deep. The soil felt soft but firm enough. It didn't seem wet, not even near the edge. Once the tent was set, I gathered firewood and set up a small circle of stones. I like to do things right. There's peace in small, slow work like that. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal, rice and beans, some sausage, coffee from my little tin pot. The sun dipped behind the trees on the far side of the river, and the shadows grew longer. The air cooled down fast. The bugs came out, but I had spray. The fire popped quietly as I leaned back in my camping chair and let myself relax for the first time in weeks. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire until close to midnight, then crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. I lay there listening to the sounds, crickets, the slow whoosh of the river, a few frogs. It was quiet, real quiet, and the stars outside were bright through the mesh of the tent's roof. I fell asleep fast, with the water nearby like a long, steady breath. I woke once in the night, just after 3 a.m., and noticed a strange sound. It was like a slow suck or slurp, barely audible. I thought maybe it was the river shifting a bit, or maybe a log rolling somewhere in the current. I didn't think much of it, just part of the wild. I adjusted my pillow, rolled to my other side, and went back to sleep. Morning came cool and gray. Mist hung low over the river, clinging to the water like smoke. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and stepped out barefoot into the dew-soaked grass. Everything felt fresh and quiet. I made coffee and oatmeal, rinsed my face in the river, and sat on a log watching the mist lift. That day passed slow. I read from an old paperback, carved a stick for no real reason, wandered upriver a ways. I found a patch of wild blueberries and picked a handful. Around 4, I heard thunder in the distance, but the clouds passed north and never broke. Still, I reinforced the tent stakes just in case. Something about the wind felt heavier. I noticed the bank edge looked slightly different that evening. The grass near the edge looked like it had shifted. Not much, just a small section where the blades tilted oddly, like the ground had sunk a bit. I stepped close and pressed my boot into the soil. It gave a little under my weight, more than I expected, but not enough to raise any alarm. I figured the river had risen a bit last night. Maybe the soil got damp near the edge. I backed off and left it alone. That night, I didn't sleep quite as well. I kept waking every couple hours, rolling from one side to the other. I felt hot and itchy in the sleeping bag. Around 2:45 a.m., I heard that sound again, the slow, wet slurp, almost like something pulling at the ground. I sat up this time. Listen, it wasn't loud, just constant, soft, rhythmic. I held my breath and listened harder. There was again a slow dragging sound, like wet earth shifting under its own weight. No animals, no footsteps, just earth moving. I unzipped the tent door slowly, careful not to make much noise, and peeked out. The moon was high, casting silver light on everything. The trees, the tent, the grass. The river looked smooth and calm, but the edge of the bank looked closer. I stepped out and walked to the edge. I crouched and saw a clear line where the soil had crumbled, fresh, loose dirt spilling a few inches down toward the water. My boot print from earlier was gone, like the edge had eaten it. I stood up straight and stepped back, measuring with my eyes how much ground had fallen away. Maybe a foot? Not more. Still, I felt uneasy. I moved the tent back a little, dragging it a couple of feet inland. The stakes resisted, like they didn't want to come out, but I managed. I reset it farther from the edge, even though it meant sleeping at a slight tilt. Better to be safe. I barely slept that night. The third morning started bright, but the wind had changed. It came from the river now, cool and steady, pushing a smell I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't rot, not quite. More like damp clay or old basements. I walked to the edge again, and this time I saw clear chunks of grass and dirt missing. Whole sections gone. The river had eaten 2 more feet overnight. There was a jagged edge now, raw soil hanging over the water. The ground where my tent had been the first night was just gone. That shook me. I stood there for minutes just staring. It didn't feel real. I'd slept right there not more than 36 hours ago, and now it was part of the river. If I hadn't moved the tent, I might have slid in during the night. Maybe slept right through it. Maybe no one would have ever found me. I packed up slowly in silence. Every movement felt heavier. I kept glancing back at the river, half expecting the ground to shift again. When I pulled the last stake, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Just under the grass, near where I'd placed my foot yesterday, the soil was hollow. Not soft, hollow, like a crust over a pocket. I broke it gently with the edge of my boot, and a fist-sized hole opened beneath it. Black, damp, empty space. The whole bank was hollowing out. That river bend, with its gentle curve and soft grass, was a trap. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic landslide, just slow, steady erosion. The river was eating the bank from the inside, day by day, pulling it into itself. You couldn't see it happening unless you stayed there and watched. And I had. I strapped on my pack and walked out fast. I didn't stop until I reached the road, and I didn't look back. I checked satellite images when I got home. Old ones, over several years. That bank had shifted more than I thought. Little by little, each season. I looked at forums, river watchers' geology posts. Turns out some rivers do that. They look calm, slow, but underneath they pull at the edges. They find weak spots and hollow them out until one day the top just gives way. Quiet, sudden, gone. I never went back. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the soft grass folding in on itself. I hear that slow, wet sucking sound, and I feel the ground shifting just under my feet, one thin layer away from the dark. I know now that the most dangerous places aren't the wild, jagged cliffs or roaring rapids. It's the quiet ones, the ones that seem still, the ones that let you sleep right on the edge, never telling you what's underneath. The river never warned me. It just waited. I parked my car on the side of a dirt road, just past noon. The drive had been longer than expected, slower too, with all the winding curves through dry pine woods and dusty inclines that made my tires slip more than once. My plan was simple. Hike a little down to the river, camp for 2 nights, maybe fish a bit, maybe ride if I felt like it. Mostly, I just wanted the silence. No phone signal out here. No traffic. Just trees, water, and the smell of dust and pine sap baking under the sun. I slung my pack over my shoulder and locked the car. It was hot, but not the worst I camped in. A dry kind of heat. The trees looked tired, though, brown along the edges, some completely charred. It wasn't until I started walking that I noticed the blackened trunks. At first, I thought it was old damage, maybe from years ago. The undergrowth had started coming back in some places. Green shoots breaking through black soil, dry grasses swaying between tree stumps. But in other places, it still smelled like smoke. Not the fresh kind. More like someone had doused a campfire with water 2 days ago and left it to rot. A bitter, almost metallic scent. As I moved further off the road, I realized I was walking through what was once the edge of a fire line. The path was uneven. The trees on either side marked with red spray paint, probably for future clearing. Some still stood, but were hollowed out and burned halfway up. Their tops were gone, their branches twisted and dry like old bones. I didn't think much of it at first. Wildfires happen a lot out here. What mattered was the river. I'd seen it on maps, slow-moving, wide, surrounded by rocky banks and narrow trails. I followed a slope down toward it, stepping carefully over loose gravel and clumps of scorched brush. There were no other campers, no footprints. Just the wind dragging ash across the trail and the occasional bird call, sparse and thin, as if the wildlife hadn't quite come back yet. When I reached the river, it looked perfect, quiet, low, with a narrow bend that formed a gravel beach shaded by a few surviving pines. I set up my tent about 15 feet from the water. The sand was soft, the wind steady, and the only sound was the trickle of current pushing around the rocks. I didn't see any fish, but I cast a line anyway and watched the ripple spread. The day passed slowly. I read a little, scribbled in a notebook, cooked a basic meal on my portable stove, and watched the sun bleed orange through a thin film of smoke still hanging in the upper air. I could see the hills in the distance, some black, some brown. It was only when the sun dipped behind them that I realized something strange. The fire line wasn't as far gone as I thought. At dusk, I wanted to gather more firewood. Most of the fallen branches crumbled when I touched them. Some were still warm. That stopped me. I crouched and put the back of my hand near a half-buried log. It wasn't hot enough to burn me, but it was definitely warmer than the air. I looked closer. There was a faint red glow deep in the cracks. A coal or ember hiding inside the wood. I checked others. Same thing. Not all of them, but a few. Some glowed only when I cracked them open, like they were holding onto the fire underground. I didn't like it. I decided not to light a fire that night. I didn't want to add anything to whatever heat still lingered in the soil. I zipped up my tent early, left the rainfly off to watch the stars. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke up sweating. The air was hotter than before, and the breeze had stopped. The river was quiet, too quiet. No frogs, no birds, no rustle of water. I sat up and looked around. The hills in the distance looked darker, but I couldn't tell if that was just the moonlight shifting or if more smoke had rolled in. I unzipped the tent and stepped out barefoot. The sand was warm. I stood still for a moment, trying to listen, trying to hear anything that might tell me this was normal. But all I could hear was my own breathing and the distant creak of trees rubbing in the windless dark. Then I smelled it again, stronger this time. Smoke, sharp and dry. Not right next to me, but not far either. I turned slowly and looked up the slope I'd come down earlier. There was a faint red flicker near the ridge, barely visible, like a dying flashlight. It blinked out once, then came back. A few seconds later, another spot lit up beside it. I stood there for maybe a full minute, unsure if it was real. But it was. The embers had never died. The fire had just gone underground, sleeping under dry roots and soil, waiting for the right wind, the right heat. It was coming back. I didn't panic, not at first. I knew I had time. The fire wasn't racing downhill. Not yet. It was creeping, flickering, flaring up as it found new fuel. But if the wind picked up or if it found a pocket of dry grass, it would move fast, faster than I could run uphill. I packed up in the dark, quick but careful. Tent collapsed, gear shoved back into my pack without order. I stuffed my sleeping bag last and looked around one more time. The red flickers had multiplied. 5, maybe 6 glowing spots now. The air smelled like burned plastic and scorched metal. Somewhere up the hill, I heard a loud pop, probably a tree splitting from heat. I took the lower trail, hugging the riverbank. It curved away from the fire line, winding around the base of a shallow cliff. The river beside me reflected nothing now, just black water, silent and still. I moved fast but kept low, trying to stay close to the rocks where the fire couldn't follow easily. But the air kept getting hotter. My shirt stuck to my back, and my eyes watered from the smoke that now hung low over the water like a film. The trail was harder to follow at night, but I had a flashlight. I used it sparingly, only when the path turned sharp or narrowed. I didn't want to be seen by what I didn't know, but I felt watched. Not by people, just by the fire itself. Like it knew I was here. By the time I reached the next bend, I could see the full shape of it on the hills behind me. A curved line of red, flickering, rising, falling, like the pulse of something alive. It moved without sound like breath. Ember to ember, spark to spark, waking up again. Then I heard the wind. It came low at first, just a push of warm air against my legs. Then it picked up fast, rushing down the slope behind me, carrying smoke and ashen waves. I turned my face away and ran. Not a sprint. There were too many rocks, too many holes, but a stumbling half run, my pack thumping against my shoulders. I don't know how long I kept moving. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The path leveled out at one point, and I stopped to drink water. My throat burned from the smoke, and my eyes wouldn't stop watering. I could still see the red line behind me, now stretched wider. More spots lit, more trees catching. The fire wasn't out of control yet, but it was spreading. Fast. I kept going. I didn't trust the trail anymore. Too narrow, too slow. I slid down a short bank and cut across a dry riverbed, following the water upstream until the rocks got too sharp to walk on. Then I climbed back up toward the tree line, looking for the old road where I'd parked. It took most of the night to find it. When I reached the car, the sky was starting to lighten. Not sunrise yet, just a deep gray before it. The smoke had followed me. It curled through the trees now, thick and low. I unlocked the door and threw my gear inside without sorting it. Then I sat for a moment, staring through the windshield at the blackened forest. I'd walked through that, slept next to it, trusted it to be dead. The fire was back. I could feel it in the air, too dry, too hot. The ground still held heat deep down. The trees looked stable, but they were shells, full of rot and ash and silent flame, waiting to breathe again. I started the engine and drove back toward the highway, slower than I should have, checking the mirrors every few minutes. There were no flames in sight, not from this angle. But I knew what I'd seen. That whole slope, burned once, thought to be safe, was waking up again. The fire line hadn't just scarred the land. It had buried itself in it, waiting. Later, when I stopped at a ranger station to report what I'd seen, they nodded, took notes, marked a map. I don't know if they believed how close it was. I don't even know if they went up that trail to check. But I knew. I saw it breathing. I saw it move. Wildfires don't always die. Sometimes they sink. Sometimes they wait. That trip was the last time I camped alone near the fire line. Even now, when I see old burn scars on trees or smell dry sap under the sun, I feel the heat rise through my shoes. And I remember walking on coals I never saw, sleeping inches from something that never really went out. You don't hear it coming. You feel it. And by then, it's already too late. I had been meaning to get away from the city for a while. My job was draining me, and the constant traffic, deadlines, and blinking screens were turning my days into a blur. I needed a quiet weekend outdoors, away from everything. I didn't want a popular campsite or a busy hiking trail. I wanted solitude, peace, and maybe a bit of silence that wasn't interrupted by car horns or ringing phones. A friend had told me once, years ago, about a stretch of river somewhere past the forest road near Lake Weller. He had mentioned in passing as a peaceful place where the trees opened up and the river curved gently along a bend, shallow enough in places to wade through, perfect for camping. I remembered his description: clean water, soft riverbank, not many people, and a good spot to fish if you like that kind of thing. He'd only been there once. Said it was real quiet, which stuck with me. So on a Friday afternoon, I packed up my gear, left a note with my roommate about where I was headed, and drove out. The plan was simple: 2 nights of camping by the river, cooking my own food, sleeping in a tent, walking through the woods during the day. I had no interest in checking my phone, no desire to hear another voice. I just wanted stillness. The drive out was longer than I expected. After an hour on the main road, I turned off onto a gravel one that cut through dense woods. Trees arched overhead, and after a while I lost the last of the cell signal. I didn't care. I followed a vague map I had saved on my phone, more of a screenshot from an old blog than a real guide. It wasn't very detailed, but it pointed to an area just past a narrow bridge, and then a sharp left down a dirt path. The path was rough, barely drivable, overgrown in places, but eventually I saw the river through the trees. It was everything I had hoped it would be. The water moved slowly in wide curves, reflecting the late afternoon light. The banks were lined with small rocks and patches of soft sand. It was quiet. No trash, no tire marks, no fire pits. Just raw, untouched nature. I parked my car in a small clearing and carried my gear down to a flat spot near a bend in the river where the water looked calm and shallow. That first night was peaceful. I set up my tent under a tree, built a small fire, and made a simple dinner, just some canned beans and bread. The night air was cool, and I could hear the river flowing steadily a few meters away. I sat for a long time watching the fire, then finally turned in. I slept well, better than I had in months. The next day, I woke up early, just as the sun was starting to rise. There was a thin mist over the river, and everything felt fresh. I made some instant coffee on my camp stove and watched the mist burn away. The plan for the day was to explore a bit, walk along the river, maybe wade into the water to cool off. It was summer, and even this early the air was warming up quickly. Around mid-morning, I walked upriver. The terrain was mostly flat, with small grassy areas between the trees and the riverbank. In some places, the water was so shallow and clear you could see the pebbles on the bottom, sunlight dancing off their smooth surfaces. I found a good spot about 15 minutes upstream. There was a wide, open bend with an overhanging tree that provided shade and a stretch of water that looked shallow enough to walk through. I tested it with a stick, barely knee-deep, perfect for cooling off. I took off my shirt and shoes, rolled up my pants, and stepped in. The water was cold, but not uncomfortably so. It was clear and moved gently around my legs. I stood there for a while, enjoying the feeling. Then I waded a little deeper. The pebbles beneath my feet were smooth and shifted slightly with each step, but there was no sign of sudden drops or sharp rocks. As I moved farther from the shore, maybe 3 or 4 steps in, something changed. I felt it before I saw it. My foot didn't touch bottom. I had taken a step forward expecting another smooth rock underfoot, but instead, there was nothing. I was mid-step, and suddenly my leg just kept going down into empty space. I lost my balance and dropped into the water. In an instant, I was submerged. I didn't just go under, I dropped straight down as if I had stepped into a hole. I flailed, tried to push off with my other foot, but it too had nothing beneath it. I sank deeper, and the cold gripped me hard. Panic kicked in. I forced my arms to move, kicked my legs, and tried to surface, but I had gone deeper than I thought possible in such a quiet, shallow-looking river. When I finally broke the surface, I gasped for air and kicked hard, trying to stay afloat. I was treading water now, barely able to keep my head above the surface. The current here was slow, but it was pulling me slightly. I looked around, coughing, and realized I had drifted a few meters from the edge. I could see the pebbly shore, maybe 6 or 7 meters away, but I couldn't feel the bottom at all. I had somehow stepped into a vertical drop right in the middle of a calm, shallow river. My heart was racing. I started swimming back toward the shore, not gracefully, just moving my arms and legs as fast as I could. My pants were heavy with water. My feet kicked at nothing. I tried not to look down, but the thought that something so deep could exist right under my feet made my chest tighten. I reached the shallows, hands clawing at the rocks, and pulled myself out. I sat on the riverbank, coughing and breathing hard. My skin was cold, my hands shaking. I had never been in a situation like that before, where everything looked safe and simple, but a single wrong step nearly dragged me under. I looked back at the spot I had fallen in. From the shore, it looked the same as the rest. Calm, shallow, inviting. But now I knew what was under that surface. A vertical hole deeper than I could touch, hidden right in the middle of the river. I waited for a long time, letting the sun dry me off and calm me down. Eventually, I walked back to camp, still barefoot, clothes sticking to my legs. I changed into dry clothes and sat by the fire pit, trying to process what had happened. It didn't make sense. There had been no warning, no change in the color of the water, nothing to show that part of the river dropped straight down. Later that day, I returned to the spot with a rope I had in my gear and a small rock tied to the end. I dropped it into the hole, curious. The rope was 10 meters long. The rock sank, pulling the rope steadily until the entire length was gone. I pulled it up again and saw that the bottom of the rope was wet and muddy. 10 meters, over 30 feet. I couldn't believe it. That deep, right in the middle of shallow river. No signs, no kittens, nothing to give it away. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about how easily I could have disappeared. No one would have heard me scream. No one even knew exactly where I was. My car was parked half hidden off a dirt road, miles from the nearest building. I had told my roommate the general area, but even that was vague. If I hadn't made it back to shore, my body might never have been found. It would have just sunk into that hole and disappeared. In the morning, I packed up early. I didn't feel like spending another night there. The peace I had come for had been replaced by unease. Before I left, I walked one last time to the bend in the river. I stood at the edge of the hole and looked out at the calm water. It still looked shallow, still looked harmless. The way the sun hit it, you couldn't see any difference. You could walk along the bank and think it was safe, think it was just like the rest. And maybe that was the worst part. It wasn't marked. No warnings, no signs. Just a hidden pit waiting beneath still water. When I got back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up maps and geological surveys. It turns out rivers like that, especially in areas with old mining activity or underground springs, can have sudden vertical sinkholes or shafts formed by erosion. Some of them go down for dozens of meters and stay filled with water year-round. The river wears away at underground cavities, and over time, the ground collapses from beneath, leaving deep vertical shafts. Sometimes, they're never discovered unless someone falls into them. That's what must have happened there. Maybe long ago, there was a spring or a cave under that part of the river, and the roof collapsed slowly until it became that hidden pit. It wasn't unnatural, just dangerous in a way you'd never expect. I told a few people about it afterward, not to scare them, just to warn them, because from the outside, that river looked perfect, quiet, peaceful, but there was a trap under that surface, a vertical hole that didn't belong there, and it almost took me down with it. Now, whenever I see calm water, especially in rivers, I don't trust the surface. I don't assume it's shallow just because it looks like it. I keep a distance, test the ground carefully, because I know better now. I know that sometimes, even in the quietest places, the ground just drops away, and no one ever tells you it's there. I had been meaning to get away from the city for a while. My job was draining me, and the constant traffic, deadlines, and blinking screens were turning my days into a blur. I needed a quiet weekend outdoors, away from everything. I didn't want a popular campsite or a busy hiking trail. I wanted solitude, peace, and maybe a bit of silence that wasn't interrupted by car horns or ringing phones. A friend had told me once, years ago, about a stretch of river somewhere past a forest road near Lake Weller. He had mentioned it in passing as a peaceful place where the trees opened up and the river curved gently along a bend, shallow enough in places to wade through, perfect for camping. I remembered his description: clean water, soft riverbank, not many people, and a good spot to fish if you liked that kind of thing. He'd only been there once. Said it was real quiet, which stuck with me. So on a Friday afternoon, I packed up my gear, left a note with my roommate about where I was headed, and drove out. The plan was simple: 2 nights of camping by the river, cooking my own food, sleeping in a tent, walking through the woods during the day. I had no interest in checking my phone no desire to hear another voice. I just wanted stillness. The drive out was longer than I expected. After an hour on a main road, I turned off onto a gravel one that cut through dense woods. Trees arched overhead, and after a while I lost the last of the cell signal. I didn't care. I followed a vague map I had saved on my phone, more of a screenshot from an old blog than a real guide. It wasn't very detailed, but it pointed to an area just past a narrow bridge and then a sharp left down a dirt path. The path was rough, barely drivable, overgrown in places, but eventually I saw the river through the trees. It was everything I had hoped it would be. The water moved slowly in wide curves, reflecting the late afternoon light. The banks were lined with small rocks and patches of soft sand. It was quiet. No trash, no tire marks, no fire pits. Just raw, untouched nature. I parked my car in a small clearing and carried my gear down to a flat spot near a bend in the river where the water looked calm and shallow. That first night was peaceful. I set up my tent under a tree, built a small fire, and made a simple dinner, just some canned beans and bread. The night air was cool, and I could hear the river flowing steadily a few meters away. I sat for a long time watching the fire, then finally turned in. I slept well, better than I had in months. The next day, I woke up early, just as the sun was starting to rise. There was a thin mist over the river, and everything felt fresh. I made some instant coffee on my camp stove and watched the mist burn away. The plan for the day was to explore a bit, walk along the river, maybe wade into the water to cool off. It was summer, and even this early the air was warming up quickly. Around mid-morning, I walked upriver. The terrain was mostly flat, with small grassy areas between the trees and the riverbank. In some places, the water was so shallow and clear you could see the pebbles on the bottom, sunlight dancing off their smooth surfaces. I found a good spot about 15 minutes upstream. There was a wide, open bend with an overhanging tree that provided shade and a stretch of water that looked shallow enough to walk through. I tested it with a stick, barely knee-deep, perfect for cooling off. I took off my shirt and shoes, rolled up my pants, and stepped in. The water was cold, but not uncomfortably so. It was clear and moved gently around my legs. I stood there for a while, enjoying the feeling. Then I waded a little deeper. The pebbles beneath my feet were smooth and shifted slightly with each step, but there was no sign of sudden drops or sharp rocks. As I moved farther from the shore, maybe 3 or 4 steps in, something changed. I felt it before I saw it. My foot didn't touch bottom. I had taken a step forward expecting another smooth rock underfoot, but instead, there was nothing. I was mid-step, and suddenly my leg just kept going down into empty space. I lost my balance and dropped into the water. In an instant, I was submerged. I didn't just go under. I dropped straight down as if I had stepped into a hole. I flailed, tried to push off with my other foot, but it too had nothing beneath it. I sank deeper, and the cold gripped me hard. Panic kicked in. I forced my arms to move, kicked my legs, and tried to surface, but I had gone deeper than I thought possible in such a quiet, shallow-looking river. When I finally broke the surface, I gasped for air and kicked hard, trying to stay afloat. I was treading water now, barely able to keep my head above the surface. The current here was slow, but it was pulling me slightly. I looked around, coughing, and realized I had drifted a few meters from the edge. I could see the pebbly shore, maybe 6 or 7 meters away, but I couldn't feel the bottom at all. I had somehow stepped into a vertical drop, right in the middle of a calm, shallow river. My heart was racing. I started swimming back toward the shore, not gracefully, just moving my arms and legs as fast as I could. My pants were heavy with water. My feet kicked at nothing. I try not to look down, but the thought that something so deep could exist right under my feet made my chest tighten. I reached the shallows, hands clawing at the rocks, and pulled myself out. I sat on the riverbank, coughing and breathing hard. My skin was cold, my hands shaking. I had never been in a situation like that before, where everything looked safe and simple, but a single wrong step nearly dragged me under. I looked back at the spot I had fallen in. From the shore, it looked the same as the rest. Calm, shallow, inviting. But now I knew what was under that surface. A vertical hole deeper than I could touch, hidden right in the middle of the river. I waited for a long time, letting the sun dry me off and calm me down. Eventually, I walked back to camp, still barefoot, clothes sticking to my legs. I changed into dry clothes and sat by the fire pit, trying to process what had happened. It didn't make sense. There had been no warning, no change in the color of the water, nothing to show that part of the river dropped straight down. Later that day, I returned to the spot with a rope I had in my gear and a small rock tied to the end. I dropped it into the hole, curious. The rope was 10 meters long. The rock sank, pulling the rope steadily until the entire length was gone. I pulled it up again and saw that the bottom of the rope was wet and muddy. 10 meters, over 30 feet. I couldn't believe it. That deep, right in the middle of a shallow river. No signs, no currents, nothing to give it away. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about how easily I could have disappeared. No one would have heard me scream. No one even knew exactly where I was. My car was parked half hidden off a dirt road, miles from the nearest building. I had told my roommate the general area, but even that was vague. If I hadn't made it back to shore, my body might never have been found. It would have just sunk into that hole and disappeared. In the morning, I packed up early. I didn't feel like spending another night there. The peace I had come for had been replaced by unease. Before I left, I walked one last time to the bend in the river. I stood at the edge of the hole and looked out at the calm water. It still looked shallow, still looked harmless. The way the sun hit it, you couldn't see any difference. You could walk along the bank and think it was safe, think it was just like the rest. And maybe that was the worst part. It wasn't marked. No warnings, no signs. Just a hidden pit waiting beneath still water. When I got back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up maps and geological surveys. It turns out rivers like that, especially in areas with old mining activity or underground springs, can have sudden vertical sinkholes or shafts formed by erosion. Some of them go down for dozens of meters and stay filled with water year-round. The river wears away at underground cavities, and over time, the ground collapses from beneath, leaving deep vertical shafts. Sometimes, they're never discovered unless someone falls into them. That's what must have happened there. Maybe long ago, there was a spring or a cave under that part of the river, and the roof collapsed slowly until it became that hidden pit. It wasn't unnatural, just dangerous in a way you'd never expect. I told a few people about it afterward, not to scare them, just to warn them, because from the outside, that river looked perfect, quiet, peaceful, but there was a trap under that surface, a vertical hole that didn't belong there, and almost took me down with it. Now, whenever I see calm water, especially in rivers, I don't trust the surface. I don't assume it's shallow just because it looks like it. I keep a distance, test the ground carefully, because I know better now. I know that sometimes, even in the quietest places, the ground just drops away, and no one ever tells you it's there. The river looked calm when I first saw it. I've been hiking alone for 2 days deep into a patch of land that sat between two state parks. I had found it by accident while studying old topographic maps. This area wasn't on any of the common trails or guidebooks. That's exactly why I chose it. I wanted something different, something quiet, somewhere I wouldn't run into tourists with speakers strapped to their backpacks or families yelling down the trail. I wanted isolation, the kind that made you think harder, sleep deeper, and listen more closely to the sound of your own breath. I parked my car at a service road entrance and hiked about 14 miles in. I had enough supplies for 4 days: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, dry food, headlamp, compass, and a backup map in case my phone died. I wasn't new to hiking or camping. I had solo camped in northern Michigan and hiked parts of the Appalachian Trail in Georgia. But this place felt more remote, less touched. The river wasn't wide, maybe 15 feet across, but it moved slow, and there were flat stones near a bend that looked perfect for crossing. I wasn't planning to cross it at first. I had planned to set up camp on the near side, but after walking along its edge for about half a mile, I saw a perfect spot across the water. A small rise in the bank, shaded by old sycamore trees, with soft moss and no undergrowth. It looked like a natural campsite, like a place that had been made for resting. And there were no tracks, no trash, no signs anyone had ever used it. I checked the depth by tossing a few stones. The river was shallow, maybe 2 feet at the deepest spot. The current didn't seem fast. The rocks looked stable. It seemed safe. So I took off my boots, tied them together, and slung them around my neck. Then I stepped in. The water was colder than I expected, even though it was late spring. The stones underfoot were slick, but I moved carefully. I was halfway across when I noticed how still the trees were on the other side. The whole bank looked untouched. Not a single broken branch, not even the usual bird chatter. I told myself that was a good thing. Peace and quiet. Exactly what I came for. I made it across without slipping. I sat on the grass to dry my feet, then put my boots back on and unpacked my gear. I pitched my tent under the trees, where the ground was soft but dry. From my spot, I had a good view of the river bend, the sun dipping low behind the trees, and the far bank where I'd come from. Everything seemed perfect. I boiled water, ate a pouch of rice and beans, and stretched out in the grass until the sky went dim. That night, I slept hard. No animal noises, no rustling branches, not even the wind. It was like being inside a padded box. I only woke once, just before dawn, to pee. The air was damp and heavy, like it had rained somewhere far upstream. I thought I heard something in the water, like a thud or splash, but when I looked around, I didn't see anything. The next morning, I ate a protein bar, refilled my bottle from the river using my filter, and decided to hike a bit farther inland to explore. I marked my camp on the GPS, just in case, and packed a small day bag. I hiked a big loop, maybe 6 miles total, cutting through thicker woods and circling back to the river from a different angle. Everything looked normal, maybe too normal. No signs of large animals, no tracks, no droppings. Just trees, moss, and silence. By mid-afternoon, I was back at camp, sweating and ready for another meal. That's when I noticed the sky darkening too early. It wasn't clouds, just dim light, like a filter had been pulled over the sun. I checked my watch, still 2 hours before sunset. The river had changed, too. It was higher now. The rocks I'd crossed yesterday were underwater, just barely, but enough to make them invisible. Still, I didn't worry yet. Rivers rise and fall. I figured it would go back down overnight. I stayed a second night. Same silence, same deep, dreamless sleep. But when I woke up the next morning, the river was higher again. Now it covered the bend entirely. The water was up to the bank on my side, and it moved faster than before. Not whitewater fast, but enough to carry branches quickly around the corner and out of sight. I walked up and down the riverbank for nearly an hour, looking for a safer crossing. Every spot I found was either too wide, too deep, or blocked by thick brush. The water wasn't violent, but it was strong, and I didn't want to risk being swept downstream with all my gear. I had enough supplies for 2 more days, so I waited. I told myself the water would go down. I could cross later, but it didn't. By the 4th day, I was out of food and nearly out of water. Filtering the river was becoming harder. The water was murky now, full of sediment and bits of rotting vegetation. My filter clogged twice that day. I had to back flush it every few hours just to keep it working. I tried to cross again that afternoon, but the river was too wide and fast. I stood there with my boots off, holding my pack above my head, and nearly lost my footing on the 3rd step. The water came up to my thighs. One wrong move, and I would have gone under. I backed out, breathing hard, legs shaking. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing things. Not animals or voices, just noises, dull knocks, something thudding softly against the bank. I knew it was probably debris floating downstream, hitting rocks or tree roots, but it still made my skin crawl. The next morning, I tried following the river downstream, thinking I'd find a better place to cross. I walked 3 hours through dense brush and swampy ground, but the river only widened. The banks grew steeper and the water darker. I never saw another spot that looked safe. By the 6th day, I was getting weak, dehydrated. My filter barely worked. I hadn't eaten anything in nearly 2 days. I tried chewing on pine needles for flavor, but it only made my stomach cramp. I tried fishing with a bit of cord and safety pin, but caught nothing. There weren't even bugs around. No flies, no beetles, not even ants. I knew I had to get across. I couldn't wait anymore. I spent most of the 7th day building a raft. I broke branches and small logs from nearby trees and tied them together using my tent lines and paracord. I laid my sleeping pad on top for flotation. It looked solid enough, but I had no idea if it would hold. That evening, I pushed it into the water, laid my pack on top, and climbed on. It drifted fine for about 20 seconds. Then it caught on something underwater. The front dipped, and cold water rushed over my legs. I kicked off and tried swimming, but the current pulled me sideways. My pack slid off and sank. I reached for it instinctively and slipped under. The cold hit me like a wall. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. I thrashed upward and broke the surface gasping, but I was already 20 feet downstream. I kicked for the far bank, but the current didn't let me. I grabbed at branches, rocks, anything, but everything was just out of reach. Finally, I caught a root sticking out from the near bank, the same side I'd started on days ago. I dragged myself out, coughing and shaking. I lay there for what felt like hours, soaking wet, watching my raft drift out of sight. I had nothing now. No food, no tent, no map. My phone was gone. My sleeping bag was waterlogged and heavy. I was stuck again on the side I thought I had left behind. I don't know why the crossing had looked so easy the first time. Maybe the river had been at a rare low that day. Maybe I'd misread the terrain. Maybe it wasn't a crossing at all, just a trap, a natural illusion, something that lured me over without showing me how hard it would be to return. I spent the night under a tree with wet clothes and no shelter. It rained lightly, and the temperature dropped fast. I shivered until dawn. The next morning, I forced myself to move. I followed the river upstream, hoping to find a narrower spot, even a fallen tree. I kept going for hours, sometimes crawling through thick brush, sometimes climbing over slick rocks. Around noon, I finally spotted something, a crude bridge of fallen logs, barely wide enough to balance on. It looked old. Maybe someone had tried to build a crossing here long ago. I tested it with my weight. It shifted but held. Carefully, one foot in front of the other, I made it across. My legs were shaking by the time I stepped onto solid ground. I didn't cheer. I didn't feel relief. Just a dull, heavy calm. I knew I was still far from help. I hiked back toward where I thought my car would be. Without GPS, I had to rely on memory and terrain. I walked for hours, slept under trees, ate leaves, and drank from muddy puddles. 2 days later, I found the road. A gravel maintenance road that led to a gate. I followed it for another hour before I heard the sound of a car. I stumbled out covered in scratches and mud, sunburned and weak. The driver didn't stop, but the second car did. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd gotten lost, crossed a river, and couldn't get back. They took me to the ranger station. They gave me water, a granola bar, and asked where I'd been. I showed them the spot on the map. The ranger squinted and said there wasn't any official trail out there. No campoons, nothing but landlocked state land and marsh. He said, people don't go out there much. I didn't say anything. Back home, I looked up the river on satellite images. I lived in one of the older dorm buildings on the edge of campus. It was one of those long, gray concrete blocks with narrow windows and a permanent smell of dust and stale air. The floors creaked even though they were concrete, and the hallways always felt colder than they should have been. The building had been used less over the years. Most students requested the newer dorms closer to the library or student union, with better heating and Wi-Fi. Mine was the last floor still in regular use. The elevator in that building had always been out of order. At least, that's what the sign said. There was a printed sheet of paper taped over the button panel on every floor. Out of order. Used stairs. It was yellowed, and the edges curled from years of being left alone. No one talked about it. I assumed it was just a hazard. Maybe the wiring was bad. Maybe it got stuck too often. The building only had 5 floors, so the stairs weren't that bad. Still, every now and then I heard it. I'd be walking back from class or staying up late to study in the lounge, and I'd hear a low mechanical hum coming from behind the elevator doors. Once or twice, I felt a faint vibration through the floor. I asked a guy on the second floor if he'd ever seen it move, and he just shrugged and said the doors never opened. That was it. Everyone ignored it. One night, in early November, I stayed back on campus to work on an assignment. Most people had gone home for the long weekend. The hallways were dead quiet, and the overhead lights flickered occasionally like they hadn't been replaced in years. I was coming up the stairs around 2 a.m., lugging my backpack and a bottle of half-warm water. When I passed the elevator on the 4th floor, I heard the hum again. But this time, The display above the door was lit. It said B1. I froze. There was no B1 in this building. The main floor was G, then 1 through 5. I'd been in and out of the stairwell dozens of times and never seen anything labeled B1 or basement. I waited, staring at the red numbers on the panel. The hum faded and the light went off. I don't know what made me do it. Curiosity, boredom, maybe just plain stupidity. I pulled the paper off the button panel and pressed the call button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The button lit up and then I heard the motor. The elevator was moving. I stepped back. It groaned like something very old had been forced into motion again. When the doors opened, the lights inside flickered on slowly, 1, 2 at a time. The floor looked dusty but solid. The button panel inside looked old too. Scratched metal with circular buttons, like something from the 70s. I stepped inside. I didn't press anything. I just wanted to look. The doors closed behind me on their own. I hit the door open button immediately, but nothing happened. The elevator began to move down. I pressed the emergency button, but there was no sound. The panel didn't even light up. I hit G, then 1, then every button. Nothing. The lights flickered again. I felt my stomach tighten. The elevator stopped after what felt like a full minute. The panel above the door read B2, not B1. There was no sound in the shaft anymore, just stillness. The doors opened. I didn't want to step out, but I didn't want to stay in either. I looked out. The hallway beyond the doors was concrete, unfinished, with rough walls and pipes running along the ceiling. The lights were dim and spaced far apart. The floor was dusty, and it smelled like mold, rust, and something sharp, like burnt wiring or stale air that hadn't moved in years. I leaned out and looked both ways. There were doors along the hallway, all metal, no labels. Some were slightly ajar. I thought maybe I found an old service level, maybe a mechanical floor or boiler room. I stepped out slowly. Behind me, the elevator doors closed. I turned around and ran back, but there were no buttons on the wall outside. No panel, nothing. Just smooth metal doors. I banged on them a few times, then stopped. It felt pointless. No one was around. No one would hear me. I took out my phone. No signal. 1 bar of battery left. I turned on the flashlight and started walking. I kept telling myself I'd find a stairwell, a service exit, something. This was part of the university. It had to be connected somewhere. I passed more metal doors. Some were bolted shut. Others looked like they hadn't been opened in years. Dust was thick on the floor. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have. There were water stains on the ceiling, and the lights kept flickering. I walked for maybe 10 minutes. No turns, no intersections. Just one long hallway. Eventually, I found a rusted stairwell door. It took me a while to force it open. It creaked painfully, and the hinges almost came off. Inside, the stairwell went both up and down. I tried going up first. The stairs ended after about 10 steps. The door at the top was welded shut. Someone had literally sealed it with metal. I tried banging on it, pulling at the seams, but it wouldn't budge. The handle had been removed. It felt more like a wall than a door. I went back down. The stairs spiraled deeper than I expected. 1 floor, then another, then another. No labels. The air got colder. The light from my phone dimmed. The battery icon blinked red. At the bottom, the stairs ended in another hallway. This one was darker, with broken light fixtures and a sloped floor. I stepped forward, and the sound of my foot hitting a puddle echoed down the corridor. Water was dripping from somewhere. The walls were lined with old equipment. Fuse boxes, rusted carts, collapsed shelves. There were broken signs in places, most of them unreadable. A few still had stencils. Utility Zone 3A, or cold water main. I found a room with the door slightly open and pushed inside. There were shelves of broken equipment. Valves, pressure gauges, buckets of corroded bolts. In the corner, a small sink dripped water into a stain that had spread across the floor. I rushed to it. The faucet was dry, but I held my mouth to the drip. It tasted like metal and old pipes, but I drank anyway. I sat on the floor and tried to figure out how deep I'd gone. I checked my phone again, completely dead. I shut off the screen and put it in my pocket. There was no sense of time down there. No clocks, no windows, just endless corridors and silence. I didn't sleep. I just wandered. I kept expecting to hear footsteps or someone calling from up above. Nothing ever came. I rationed the sink water and chewed on a half-eaten granola bar I'd forgotten in my bag. My head pounded. I couldn't think straight. I started writing notes in my notebook just to stay sane, where I'd walked, which doors I'd passed, what turns I'd taken. I marked corners with pen strokes or lines of dust scraped clean. The light overhead would flicker every few minutes, and I started using that as a rough count of time. Maybe every flicker was a few minutes, maybe an hour. I couldn't tell anymore. Once I heard a loud clang somewhere behind me, like a metal door slamming shut. I froze. I waited for footsteps, voices, anything. Nothing came, just silence. I don't know how long I stayed down there. Maybe 3 days. I felt weaker every hour. My legs shook. I tried yelling sometimes, but it just echoed down empty halls. Then one day, if it was day, I saw light. It was different from the flickering yellow bulbs. This light was white, steady, and brighter than anything else. It was coming from a narrow doorway at the end of one hallway. I staggered toward it. Inside, I found another elevator. It looked newer than the first one. The walls were cleaner, the buttons lit. There was no label on the door, but the panel inside had modern buttons, B2 through G. I pressed G with shaking hands. The doors closed. The elevator moved. When it opened, I was back on the ground floor. The lobby was empty. The old front desk was still there, dusty and unused. The lights were on, faintly. It felt like walking back into a different world. I stumbled out. My legs barely held me. I walked toward the entrance, pushed open the front doors, and collapsed on the steps outside. A campus security guard found me a few minutes later. He didn't say anything, just helped me up and called an ambulance. They thought I'd been locked in a storage area or got lost during renovations. I didn't explain. I couldn't. No one would have believed me. I spent 2 nights in the hospital. They said I was severely dehydrated. My kidneys were fine, but just barely. I lost 6 pounds. My phone was dead. The screen cracked from the damp air. When I came back to campus, the elevator was taped off completely. The paper sign was gone, replaced with an actual lockout system and a notice, condemned floor, do not access. I tried to ask around. No one had ever heard of a B2. One of the older maintenance guys said the building was built on top of an old service tunnel network in the 60s, used for heating and water systems. Most of it had been sealed decades ago when the school upgraded. No maps, no access points, just a forgotten part of campus infrastructure. I never found the original elevator again. The hallway it was in got sealed off a week later with drywall and caution tape. Someone didn't want people going down there anymore. Sometimes I dream about it. The lights flickering, the low hum of the elevator motor, the endless hallway. I wake up with my throat dry and my hands shaking. I don't use elevators anymore. I take the stairs. The first night I heard it, I was already having trouble sleeping. It had been a long drive to get to the campsite, deep in the forest, right along the edge of the river that curved like a silver snake through the trees. I come out here alone, wanted to clear my head. I was between jobs, between apartments, between relationships. Nothing was steady, and I thought some time alone in the wild might help me feel grounded again. I had set up my small tent on a patch of flat ground about 20 feet from the riverbank. It was late September, cool enough to need a jacket, but not yet cold enough for frost. The river ran quietly, steady and smooth. During the day, birds chirped, leaves rustled, and occasionally I'd see a deer pass in the distance. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. But that first night, I lay on my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the normal forest sounds fade into the hush of night. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard a splash. It wasn't loud, just a soft plunk like someone tossing a stone into the water. I assumed it was a fish, maybe a raccoon. I didn't think much of it and went back to trying to sleep. The next night, it happened again, this time a little louder. More than once. Splash, then a pause. Splash, then silence. It was past midnight, and I was still awake. Something about the way the sound came in intervals bothered me. Animals make noise, sure, but this was too regular, too measured. I sat up in my tent and listened closely. Nothing, just the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of branches. Then a single splash closer this time. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, catching the glint of water and the pale bark of trees. I scanned a riverbank, but saw nothing. No movement, no animals. The water was calm, as if nothing had disturbed it. I stood there for a while, watching, waiting. But there was nothing. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent, unsettled. The third night, I was ready for it. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up, fully clothed, flashlight ready, knife within reach. It came at the same time, just past midnight. Splash. Then again. Splash. And again. I burst out of the tent, light sweeping wildly across the trees and river. Again, nothing. The sound stopped the moment I stepped outside. It was like whatever was causing it knew when I came out. I paced the bank for over an hour, shining the light into the trees, the river, even the bushes. I found no prints, no tracks, no movement. It was as if the splashes came from nowhere. I tried to tell myself it was an animal. Maybe a beaver. Maybe something nocturnal I didn't know much about. But the pattern of the splashes didn't sit right with me. It was always 3 or 4, spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional. It made me feel watched. On the 4th day, I decided to explore further along the river. I walked a couple miles downstream, keeping close to the water, looking for signs of wildlife. I saw deer tracks, raccoon prints, even the twisted marks of snakes slithering through mud, but nothing near the area I camped. That patch of riverbank was clean. Too clean. No animal signs. No birds in the trees above. It was like nature avoided that spot. I thought about moving camp, but I didn't want to feel chased off by something I couldn't see. I stayed one more night. Again, I waited. Splash, splash, splash. Closer this time. I moved quickly, slipping out silently, trying to catch whatever it was before it disappeared. But again, I saw nothing. I even waded into the river a bit, sweeping my light along the water. It was cold, and the current tugged at my legs, but I found nothing. On the 5th night, I tried a new tactic. I set up a small motion sensor camera, the kind hunters use. I pointed it at the riverbank where the splashes seemed to come from. I also stayed awake again, ready to see what the camera might catch. The splashes came, soft and even. I didn't move. I waited until morning. When I checked the camera, my stomach turned. There were 3 images, all blurry. The first showed just the trees. The second showed something, a figure, maybe, but it was obscured by motion. The third was black, not underexposed, not blank. Black like the lens had been covered. I examined the camera. The lens was fine, but there were scratches on the casing. 3 deep marks like something had clawed or scraped at it. I packed it up and stared out at the river. I didn't know what to think anymore. I started to feel uneasy during the day, too. The air felt heavy. The woods seemed too quiet. I realized I hadn't heard birds near the sighting days. Even the insects seemed to avoid it. My appetite faded. I was jumpy, always turning at the sound of snapping twigs. I told myself I'd leave the next day. One more night, and I'd go. That night, the splashes started earlier, just after dusk. I hadn't even zipped up the tent yet. Splash, then another. I crouched inside the tent, knife in hand, light off. I waited. I wanted to know if it would come closer. I sat like that for hours. And then, just outside the tent, I heard footsteps. Not animal steps, human steps. Slow, deliberate. They moved along the riverbank, just beyond the nylon wall of my tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps stopped. Then, the sound of water. A single splash. Then retreating footsteps. I counted to 100 before moving. When I stepped outside, the river was calm. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints. But the feeling that someone had been there was unmistakable. I packed my bag in silence, shoved everything into the car, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit a highway. When I finally pulled over at a gas station, it was almost dawn. I sat in the car for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I heard splashes in the river and saw a blurry figure on a trail cam? That something scraped my camera and walked near my tent in the dark? It sounded crazy, but I knew what I heard. I knew what I felt. A few days later, I did some digging. I looked up incidents near that river. Nothing recent, but I found something. A About a decade ago, a man had gone missing near the same stretch of river. His camp had been found abandoned, tent unzipped, gear left behind. No signs of a struggle, no signs of him, just gone. The article didn't say much, just that the river had been searched and nothing found. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know what I almost saw, but I haven't been camping since. Not alone, not near water. Sometimes, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I'll hear it in my mind, the soft, measured splash. And I wonder if I had waited longer, stayed another night, would I have ended up like that man? I still don't believe in ghosts. I don't think it was supernatural. I think it was someone, a person, someone who knows the forest too well. Someone who moves in the dark and watches from the trees. Someone who waits for the right moment. The splash wasn't the scary part. It was the silence that followed. The sense that I wasn't alone. That I'd never been alone. And that someone out there, someone real, was watching. I had been planning the trip for a few weeks. I needed time away from work, from my phone, from everyone. The stress had been piling up, and the only thing that seemed to calm my nerves lately was walking along rivers or through woods. I liked the sound of water moving slowly over rocks, the smell of wet earth, and the quiet. No car horns, no people talking over each other, just the open air and the steady pulse of nature. I found a spot on a map that looked perfect, a bend in a riverway out in the countryside. No houses nearby, no hiking trails marked, just a gentle loop in the river and a flat stretch of land beside it. I figured I could park a few miles away and hike in. I'd bring everything on my back and camp near the inside curve of the river. The river there widened a little, probably making for a slower current. That usually meant softer banks, less noise, maybe even a good fishing spot. The map showed a forest just beyond the curve and a small ridge on the far side that looked climbable. It seemed like the kind of place no one would bother to go unless they were looking for solitude. I packed light, but carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water purifier, extra socks, small axe, first aid kit. I always double-checked the weather. The forecast looked fine, cloudy with a chance of light rain on one of the nights. Nothing unusual. No warnings or alerts. It took me most of a day to get there. I parked where the road ended, slung on my pack, and hiked the last stretch through uneven ground and thick trees. It was early evening when I got to the river bend. The place was even better than I imagined. The river bent sharply, forming almost a half moon around a sandy clearing with some grass and soft dirt. Trees lined the far side. The water looked calm and slow moving, and the area was quiet except for the occasional chirp of insects and the distant rustle of branches. I set up my tent close to the edge of the trees, about 30 feet from the riverbank. There were signs that deer or some other animals came to drink from the water, but nothing fresh. I boiled some instant noodles, drank water from my bottle, and sat with my back to a tree watching the river. The sun was setting behind the ridge, and the light faded fast. I stayed up a bit longer listening to the sounds of the forest before climbing into my tent. My phone had no service out here, which was part of the point. I checked the time, 9:17 p.m., and then put in my bag. The first night was quiet. I woke up once around 2 a.m. needing to pee. The forest was dark and cold. I stepped out barefoot, feeling the cold, damp ground beneath my feet, did what I needed to do, and crawled back inside. I was back asleep quickly. The next morning I made coffee and oatmeal, took a slow walk along the bank, and dipped my feet in the river. It was cold and clean, and I sat for a while watching the water move. There were little fish darting around near the edge. I collected some dry branches and twigs, though I didn't plan on making a fire yet. The sky was overcast, just a heavy gray with no real definition, like a thick blanket stretching across the sky. Later that afternoon, the wind picked up a bit, and I noticed the clouds thickening. I wasn't worried. Clouds move. Sometimes they build and break apart with no rain at all. Still, I made sure my tent's rainfly was secure and moved a few items inside, just in case. Around dusk, I heard distant thunder, but I couldn't tell how far. It was just a low grumble that came and went. I figured it might pass in the night. I boiled more water and made dinner. It was colder now. The breeze felt heavier, carrying the smell of wet dirt and leaves. I zipped my jacket and sat inside the tent for a while, reading from a paperback book I brought. Around 10 p.m., it started to rain. Just soft tapping on the rain fly, nothing heavy. I lay down and listened to it. Rain like that helps you sleep. I was out within minutes. Sometime later, I wasn't sure how much later, I woke up to a sound I didn't recognize. It wasn't thunder, though the thunder was still rolling somewhere in the distance. This was a low, dull roar. It sounded like something far away but wide, like wind but deeper. I sat up. The rain was heavier now, hitting the tent harder, and I could feel cold air coming in from under the edge of the rain fly. I checked the time. It was 3:26 a.m. The sound grew louder over the next few minutes. It had rhythm to it, a churning, pushing rhythm like a wave being shoved forward by some unseen force. That's when I realized it was the river. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the rain. It wasn't just a drizzle anymore. The rain was coming down fast, thick drops pelting the leaves, splashing off the dirt. I turned toward the river and my stomach dropped. It was closer than before. A full 10 feet of the bank I'd walked that morning was now underwater. The river had risen and was moving faster, brown and foamy in places. Debris floated along, small branches, leaves, bits of bark. I scanned upstream, squinting through the rain. I couldn't see far, but I could hear it now, clearer than ever. The roar of more water coming, faster water. I knew flash floods could happen, but I had never imagined one at night, in a place that didn't seem steep or narrow. I pulled on my boots and jacket. My heart was pounding now. I threw everything I could into my pack, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid. I didn't even bother trying to roll things properly. I just shoved them in and yanked the straps tight. I tore down the tent, which was already soaked, and shoved that in too. I didn't know how much time I had. The river looked like it was rising by the minute. I had to move. The problem was that the way I came in was now the lowest part of the area. The trail I had walked before cut across a dip between two hills, right near the narrowest part of the river's bend. If the river rose enough, that area would flood first. I didn't have a lot of good options. I turned toward the ridge. The trees up there were dense, the slopes steep and muddy, but it was high ground. My best chance. I hoisted the pack on my back and started walking fast. The ground was soft and slick underfoot. Every step felt like I was slipping, like my boots couldn't find grip. I kept checking over my shoulder. The river was still rising. It had taken another few feet of ground already. I could hear bigger things breaking in the water now, branches cracking, rocks shifting. I tried to block it out and kept moving. The incline toward the ridge was sharper than I thought. My legs were already burning from the climb, and my soaked clothes stuck to my skin. Rainwater ran down my face and inside my jacket. I pushed through underbrush and small saplings, using their trunks to pull myself higher. The trees here were thick but shallow-rooted. One or two bent as I grabbed them. I avoided the ones that moved. I don't know how long it took to reach the top. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe 40. It felt like forever. When I got there, I dropped the pack and turned back toward the river. It was no longer a river. It was a wide, sweeping torrent of water that had swallowed the entire bend and was now climbing over the dip where I had walked in. The trees along the bank were partly underwater. Some had been torn from their roots and were drifting downstream. The place where my tent had been was gone, completely under. The water was still rising, still pushing forward with heavy force. I stood there, soaked and shaking, watching it all happen in silence. It was hard to take in. I wasn't used to this kind of violence from nature. I had always thought of rivers as peaceful places. This one had turned into a moving wall of destruction in less than an hour. I stayed on the ridge for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I just sat under a thick tree with my wet pack at my feet and tried to stay warm. The rain didn't let up until just after dawn. The sky stayed gray, but the worst of the storm had passed. The water had stopped rising, though it still rushed by in deep, muddy waves. By mid-morning, I was able to make my way down the far side of the ridge. The ground was wet and dangerous, and I slipped more than once. I walked along the high ground parallel to the river for a while, looking for a safe place to cross or get out. Eventually, I found a thin trail, probably made by animals, that led back toward the direction I'd come from, but at a higher elevation. It took me another 4 hours to find the old logging road where I'd parked. The car was still there, though branches and leaves were scattered across the roof and windshield. I was lucky. Later that week, I read a news article about the storm. It had dumped a huge amount of rain upriver in the mountains far from where I had been. Flash floods had occurred in several spots. A couple of hikers had been caught off guard and had to be rescued by helicopter. One camper didn't make it out. The article didn't say their name or location, but it made my stomach turn. It could have been me. If I had waited another 30 minutes. If I had fallen on the slope. If I had hesitated. I think about that trip often now. I still camp sometimes, but never close to riverbeds. Never in low areas, and never without checking not just the weather at my location, but the entire upstream watershed. Flash floods don't ask for permission. They don't knock. They just come. What scared me most wasn't the water or even the storm. It was how quiet it had been before. How peaceful. Like the world was lulling me into thinking I was safe, right up until it wasn't. I thought I understood nature before. I thought being alone out, there was freedom. Now, I had been hiking alone for a few days along a river trail that ran through a national forest. It wasn't the first time I'd done something like that. I like being alone in nature. There was something about the quiet and the rhythm of walking beside moving water that made me feel clear-headed. I packed light, just enough food for a few days, a water filter, my one-person tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I always picked spots close to the riverbank, not right on it, but close enough that I could hear the flow at night. That afternoon, I found a wide gravel clearing about 20 yards from the water. The ground was level, shaded on one side by a line of trees, and there were no signs of other campers. I liked that. It was around 4, and I figured it was a good time to set up for the evening. I pitched my tent the same way I always did, tight, facing east with a zipper flap toward the water, so I could sit in the doorway and watch the current if I wanted to. I made a small meal of rice and dried sausage, then rinsed out my pot and let it dry in the sun. Around 6, I decided to go for a walk before the sun dipped too low. I brought my water bottle and a small pocket knife, and I followed the river upstream. I didn't expect to go far, maybe 30-40 minutes, but I kept walking because it was quiet and I liked the way the late sun hit the surface of the water. I saw a couple of beaver dams and what I think were some bear tracks in the mud near a bend, but they were old. Everything felt normal. I took my time coming back. The light had changed by then, lower and golden. I followed the sound of the river more than the trail as I retraced my steps. When I got back to my clearing, I saw a second tent. It was about 15 feet from mine. Same size, same shape, same color, same brand, even the same orientation, zipper flap facing the river. At first, I thought I was confused. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn and ended up at someone else's site. But then I saw my cookware drying where I'd left it. My backpack was right where I'd leaned it against a rock. It was my campsite. That other tent hadn't been there before. I stood still for a while, staring at it. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No movement inside the tent. I walked slowly around it. There were no footprints in the dirt around it that I could see. The ground was a little rocky though, so that didn't mean much. Still, it didn't look disturbed. The tent was zipped up all the way. I didn't want to get too close, so I sat down by my own tent, not taking my eyes off the second one. I stayed there for about an hour, doing nothing. The sun went down. I turned on my flashlight, but kept it angled low, scanning the brush now and then, waiting for someone to come back. No one did. Eventually, I got tired of waiting. I figured maybe someone set up while I was gone and went for a walk themselves. But something about it didn't feel right. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anyone leave. And that tent, same brand, same model, even the guy lines were tied the way I tied mine. Same knots. I wasn't sure what that meant, but I didn't like it. I didn't feel safe sleeping with that tent so close and no idea who was inside or where they'd gone. But it was too dark to move to another spot, and I wasn't about to hike with only a flashlight. I decided to sleep lightly and check again in the morning. I unrolled my sleeping bag, got inside my tent, and zipped it up. I left the knife under my pillow, just in case. I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up. I kept imagining footsteps outside. Once I thought I heard a zipper, but when I looked out, nothing had changed. The second tent just sat there, zipped tight, same as before. When it got light, I got up and stepped outside right away. The air was cold and damp, but it felt better to be out in it. I checked the second tent. Still zipped, still silent. I circled it again, slow this time, looking for signs of movement. I still didn't hear anything. Finally, I crouched down and called out, just a quick hello. No response. I called louder. Nothing. My skin prickled a little. I walked back to my tent, grabbed a stick, and used it to gently poke the side of the second tent. No sound. No movement. I poked again, this time a little harder. Still nothing. I stepped back and stood there for a while. Then I went to make breakfast. Instant oatmeal. I watched the other tent while I ate it. I was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe someone got scared and left in the night. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But how would anyone know what kind of tent I had? Or where I'd be? After I finished eating, I walked over again and crouched next to the second tent. I grabbed the zipper and slowly opened it a few inches. I stopped and listened. Nothing. I opened it more. The inside was empty. No sleeping bag. No backpack. No food. No flashlight. Not even dirt or leaves inside. The tent looked like it had just been unpacked. Clean floor. Tight walls. It looked like it had never been used. That's what made it so strange. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, looking at it, then zipped it back up. I packed my gear fast. It didn't feel right staying there anymore. Something about that tent made my stomach tight. I hadn't seen or heard anyone, and I didn't like not knowing. I hiked downstream this time. I figured if someone had followed me, maybe they wouldn't expect me to go that way. I walked until my legs were sore, maybe 7 miles. I passed 2 other campers going the other way. I didn't say anything about the tent. I found another site near a wide bend in the river and set up again. This time I camped farther from the water, just in case. The rest of the day was quiet. No one came by. I didn't leave the site. Just sat, watched the river, tried to calm down. When I finally went to sleep, it was late. The wind had picked up and the trees swayed. The tent made small rustling sounds all night, but it was better than silence. In the morning, I stepped out and scanned the area. No second tent. Everything was the way I left it. I stayed there one more day, just to rest, then hiked back to the trailhead the next morning. I drove home and didn't tell anyone about what happened for a few days. I kept going over it in my head, trying to figure it out. Eventually, I started digging. I checked forums, camping blogs, Reddit threads, anything. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I thought maybe someone else had seen something like it. After a few days of reading, I found a thread in an old hiking forum. A guy described almost the same thing. Solo camping, leaves his tent to hike, comes back, and there's a second tent just like his. Empty, clean. He packed up and left too. The thread was from 3 years ago. No one replied to it. Then I found another post, different site, different state, similar story. No explanation. I kept thinking about it. I tried to be rational. The best I could come up with was this. Someone was copying campers. Not hurting them, just messing with their heads. Some kind of psychological thing. Maybe filming it. Maybe for social media or some weird experiment. That was the only thing that made sense. But it didn't explain how they got the exact same tent. The same knots. The same setup. It felt too personal. The thought that stuck with me the most wasn't that someone had followed me. It was that someone had watched me closely enough, long enough to mirror me. And they wanted me to know they had. Not to hurt me. Just to remind me I wasn't really alone. That was the last time I camped alone for a long while. When I finally did again, I bought a different tent. Different color. Different shape. And I never hiked without keeping sight of my campsite. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. Or if I'd opened that second tent and found something inside. Maybe there was nothing. Maybe it was just a blank space test. But I don't really want to know. All I know is someone went through a lot of effort to show me that they could be close without being seen. That's what stuck with me. Not the tent. Not the silence. The watching. I had planned a trip weeks in advance. A solo camping trip along the river. Something quiet. Something real. I had been working too many hours and needed something to reset my head. The plan was simple. Drive north, park near the forestry access road, hike about a mile along the riverbank, pitch my tent, and spend 3 days doing nothing but reading, writing, cooking over a small flame, and watching the water move. I picked the river because I'd been there once before, years ago with friends. Back then, it was all laughter and beers and wet shoes. But what I remembered most was how calm the place felt. The water wasn't too loud, the woods weren't too thick, and the trails weren't crowded. I liked that. There was one section, though, an odd bend in the river with a big, flat rock formation along the bank that the locals avoided. I remember asking about it once at a general store, and the guy behind the counter only said something vague like, "People don't swim there. Too many accidents." No stories, no drama, just that. I had no intention of swimming. I wasn't there for that. I wasn't looking for thrills. I just wanted a spot where I wouldn't hear cars or people or phones. The drive up took longer than I expected. I got stuck behind a logging truck for nearly 40 minutes on a winding road with no shoulder. By the time I reached the parking spot and locked the car behind the metal barrier, it was already late afternoon. I could see the light starting to shift to that soft gold color. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started down the trail. It was steeper than I remembered, but the cool air made it easier. The smell of pine and dirt settled into my nose. The crunch of dry leaves followed every step. A few birds flitted overhead. My boots found their rhythm, and my brain started to shut off the work thoughts. About half an hour in, the river came into view. It was exactly how I remembered it. Long and winding, dark green water under the shade, and patches of bright, glittering surface where the sun hit it just right. I found a clearing not far from the bend, maybe 100 feet up from that flat rock area. It was the only spot big enough for a tent without having to do too much clearing. I dropped my bag, took a breath, and started setting up. It took about 20 minutes to get the tent up, and another 10 to dig a small fire pit. I gathered some kindling, made a perimeter with rocks, and filled my bottle at the river using a filter pouch. As I squatted by the edge, I noticed how strong the current was, especially toward the middle. The water didn't look violent, but there was a slow pull to it, like it had weight behind it. I dipped my fingers in, cold but not shocking. That night, I made a small fire and ate a packet of dehydrated rice and chicken. I sat back against a log, my legs stretched toward the warmth. The sky dimmed fast once the sun dipped behind the treetops. By the time the stars came out, I felt like I was 1,000 miles from anything. The only sound was the river. It never stopped. That constant rush and ripple, steady and deep. I slept okay that night. Not great. I kept waking up to little things, rustling branches, snapping twigs, the river. At one point, maybe around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something heavier than an animal walking near the tent, but when I unzipped and looked out with my flashlight, nothing was there. Just trees and the soft glint of moonlight on the water. The next day, I boiled water for coffee and walked the bank a little. I didn't have any cell signal, which was fine by me. I wasn't expecting any. I followed the river downstream, toward that bend, curious more than anything. I didn't see any signs or fences, nothing that said stay out or danger, just the same uneven rock shelves and tree roots along the edge. When I got to the bend, I saw what made it different. The river curved hard, almost 90 degrees, and the water pooled a little wider there. There were shallow parts, but right at the middle, it went deep fast. You could see the color shift from clear brown to inky green in just a few feet. The rock shelf, I remembered, jutted out like a small dock, flat, pale, and dry. I stood there a while just listening. The water wasn't any louder there, but it was faster, like something was moving beneath it. Leaves caught in the current didn't just float past. They were dragged, spun in little circles, pulled down, then spat back out yards away. It was subtle, but it was there, a quiet kind of violence. I didn't step on the rock. I stayed back a few feet. The ground there was damp and slippery. I marked the area with a stick just to remind myself not to walk too close. I figured the stories were true. Undertow, strong current probably caught more than a few swimmers off guard. I made a mental note not to collect water from that spot and turned back toward camp. The rest of the day was normal. I read, made lunch, napped. Around 4 p.m., I went to gather more wood and refill my bottle. I figured I'd go upstream this time, away from the bend. But the bank there was muddy and hard to climb. I didn't want to slip and get soaked, so against better judgment, I walked back toward the bend, staying well away from the edge, just close enough to get water from one of the calmer pools. I squatted low, filtered a bottle, and then noticed something about the shelf rock. It had scratches. Not natural ones. Long, straight lines like gouges from something metal. I stood up and looked closer. There were more, parallel lines, all in the same direction, ending at the edge. They looked like they'd been made by hands grabbing at something, or maybe by shoes scraping as someone slid toward the water. I stepped back. It gave me a strange feeling. Not fear exactly, just a sense that this wasn't a place to linger. I turned around and headed straight back to camp. That night, I didn't make a fire. I stayed in the tent, reading by flashlight, but I couldn't focus. The sound of the river felt louder now, or maybe just more noticeable. It filled every space, every pause between pages. It wasn't crashing or anything. It was smooth, endless, but I started to pick up something else in it. Not voices, not anything irrational, just irregularities. Like parts of the water moved differently than the rest. At one point, I got up and unzipped the tent just to see it. The moon was high, casting a faint silver line along the bed. Everything looked normal, but I saw movement, a branch floating maybe, or something bigger. I stepped out barefoot, careful where I walked. I got close enough to see the water, but not too close to the drop-off. And there was again movement, a ripple against the current. Something briefly broke the surface, then disappeared. No splash, just a shift. It could have been a log, could have been a big fish. Still, I didn't like it. I backed into the tent and zipped it shut. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about those scratches, the way the current pulled things under, the way leaves didn't just float by, they vanished. I imagined someone slipping on that flat rock, their feet scrambling for grip, fingers clawing the stone. I imagined the soundless plunge into the dark water, the slow realization that nothing underneath was helping you rise. I didn't sleep more than an hour that night. By sunrise, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed up everything fast. The air felt wrong, too still. I skipped breakfast, zipped my bag, and headed back toward the trail. But as I passed the bin one last time, I saw something that stopped me cold. Near the edge of the rock shelf, just barely visible where the water lapped at the stone, was a corner of fabric. Faded blue, like denim. It was caught under the surface, anchored by something. I knelt down, cautious, and reached out with a long stick. I pushed it toward the fabric, trying to nudge it free, but it didn't move. That's when I noticed the shoe. It wasn't floating. It was just under the surface, maybe 6 inches deep. Mud had built up around it. It was worn, dark, waterlogged. I didn't see a foot inside, but I didn't want to keep looking. I dropped the stick and stepped back fast. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to leave it alone. My second was to take a photo and report it. But I had no signal, and the idea of staying there longer made my stomach turn. I took the photo anyway. Then I walked. Fussed. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I drove out without looking back. At the first town I passed, I stopped at a gas station and asked where the nearest ranger office was. They pointed me to a building a few blocks away. I walked in, showed them the photo, and explained where I'd been camping. The ranger's expression didn't change much, but he asked me to mark the spot on a map. I did. He nodded slowly. "That's the drowning spot," he said, almost to himself. "People think it's cursed or haunted or whatever, but it's not. It's just bad geology." He explained it plainly. The way the river bent, the shape of the bottom, the angle of the bedrock. It all created a siphon effect, a hidden undertow. Anything that went into that part of the water, even if it floated, got pulled under and trapped against the stone shelf. It didn't need to be deep. It just needed to be fast and constant. If someone fell in, even in shallow water, they'd be dragged sideways and down. And once you were under, the current pinned you to the bottom. It wasn't a slow drowning either. It was sudden. You didn't even have to be far from shore, just in the wrong spot. He said they pulled bodies from there before. Not many, not often. Most people avoided it. Word got around, even if there weren't signs. Locals knew not to go near it. I set up my tent about 10 feet from the edge of the river. It wasn't a big river. It was the kind that curved lazily through a wide, flat valley, maybe 20 feet across at most, shallow and slow moving. The water was clear, with smooth brown stones underneath. You could see small fish darting around near the bank. It looked peaceful, the kind of place you'd expect to find on the front of a camping brochure. I've been hiking most of the day, nothing too serious, just one of those forest trails with old signs and half-maintained paths. I wasn't that far from the main road, maybe a few miles, but it felt remote enough. No cell signal, no noise, just trees, dirt, and this quiet little river. I had all my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and even a small camp stove. It was meant to be an easy overnight trip. Just get away for a bit, clear my head. I picked a flat spot just above a small slope that led to the water's edge. The soil was firm, not too sandy, and there were no obvious signs of flooding. I made sure of that. I always check. The high water mark, the line of leaves and sticks pushed up by past floods, was at least 6 feet lower than where I was pitching the tent. I felt safe. I always respected rivers, especially when camping near one. They're beautiful, but they can turn dangerous fast if you're careless. I set up my tent, unpacked, boiled some water for dinner, and sat near the water's edge while the sun dropped behind the trees. The river made a soft sound as it moved around rocks and branches. Mosquitoes came out once the air cooled, but I had spray and long sleeves. I stayed out there until the stars came out, watching the reflection in the water. I didn't notice anything strange that first night. I went to sleep with the sound of the water in the background. It was quiet enough to be soothing, but just loud enough to remind me I wasn't alone in the woods. Nature was always making noise: bugs, frogs, water, wind, and trees. That kind of noise made me feel safer, not more nervous. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to pee. I stepped out of the tent barefoot, stood in the dark, and looked toward the river. The moon was out, not full, but bright enough to see outlines. The water looked a little closer than I remembered. I took a few steps toward it, my feet crunching on dry leaves, and looked down the slope. It was definitely higher. Not by much, maybe a foot, but still. There was no rain. I was sure of that. The sky was clear. The ground under my feet wasn't wet. I hadn't heard any storms upstream during the day either, but I didn't overthink it. Maybe I'd misjudged the distance when I first set up. Rivers rise and fall. That's normal. I went back inside and fell asleep again. By morning, the water was lower, back where it was the day before. I figured I was just tired last night and imagined the difference. I made breakfast, packed a small bag, and went for a hike up the ridge behind my campsite. There was a trail that looped around to a lookout point. From the top, I could see the winding path of the river through the trees. It really was shallow and narrow, almost like a long creek in some places. No rapids, no whitewater, just lazy bends and clear water. When I got back to camp in the afternoon, I walked to the river to rinse sweat off my face. That's when I noticed it again. The water line was higher than it had been when I left. This time, it was at least 2 feet higher. Still no rain. No clouds. No noise upstream. No reason for it. I looked across the river, thinking maybe a beaver dam had collapsed or something shifted upstream. But I couldn't see anything. No lulls. No changes. I didn't like it. I decided I'd leave in the morning instead of staying a second night. I still had daylight and everything was dry, so I wasn't worried about the tent. But I made a mental note not to sleep too deeply. That night, after dinner, I sat on a rock near the fire and kept checking the water. Every 30 minutes or so, I stood up, walked over, and looked at where the edge touched the rocks. It didn't change much while I was watching. Maybe an inch here or there, nothing obvious. Eventually, I got tired and went inside the tent. I left the rain fly open so I could hear the water clearly. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. The sound was different. Not louder exactly, but fuller. It sounded like the water was closer, thicker. I sat up and immediately noticed the air felt damp. Not just cool, but sticky like fog was rolling in. I stepped outside with my flashlight and shined it toward the river. The water was right at the base of the slope. That meant it had risen at least 4 feet. In the middle of the night. No storm. No warning. I could see the wet edge glistening in the beam of my light. The stones that were dry earlier were now underwater. The little trail I'd used to fill my water bottle was gone. I felt something in my chest then. Not panic, but a deep unease. I've been in woods plenty of times, but this wasn't right. Water doesn't rise like that unless something serious is happening upstream. A dam break, a flash flood, but I didn't hear anything. No road, no rusin. It was rising without a sound. I threw everything in my backpack, left the tent up, and just grabbed what I needed. My headlamp, map, GPS, food, first aid kit, and jacket. I figured I'd hike to higher ground and wait for daylight. I didn't want to stumble around in the dark trying to find a trailhead but I also didn't want to sleep next to a river that was sneaking up on me inch by inch. I moved quickly, but kept checking behind me every few minutes. The water didn't seem to be moving fast, but it was steady. It wasn't pulling in debris or leaves. It was just rising, quietly. I climbed a ridge trail behind my site and found a flat ledge about 20 feet up. It was dry and had a good view of the river below. I sat down, wrapped myself in my jacket, and waited for morning. From that spot, I watched the river push past where my tent was. It kept going. The water line climbed past the slope, swallowed the fire pit, and spread across the flat ground where I had slept. The tent started to tilt, then fall as the ground softened. Eventually, it was floating slightly, caught on one corner, flapping gently like a flag caught in slow wind. It wasn't natural. There was no surge, no wave. It was like someone was slowly turning up a faucet somewhere upstream, but not violently. Just slow, steady, unstoppable. By dawn, the water had moved at least 20 feet inland. Then it stopped. As the sun rose, it receded. Not fast, but definitely faster than it had risen. I watched it pull back over the course of a few hours, until it was almost back to its original path. I climbed down cautiously after mid-morning. My tent was soaked. My firewood was floating. I checked the high ground and saw no more signs of danger, but I still packed everything and left. I didn't wait for anything else. As I hiked out, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe there was a reservoir upstream. Maybe they were testing releases or draining something. But there were no signs posted, no markers warning about sudden water changes. And besides, who runs water like that at night? That quietly? When I got back to the small parking area, I checked the map on my phone. There was no dam upstream, no SBUA, no man-made source of water. The river came from a series of springs in the hills, winding down through untouched forest. No towns, no farms, no one controlling it. I still wanted an explanation. A few days later, I did some digging online. I looked up floodplain data, geological surveys, old news articles. I found one thing that stuck with me. About 10 years ago, a team of researchers have been studying underground water movement in that region. Gust formation. That's when water carves through limestone underground and creates hidden channels, caves, even sinkholes. One of the reports mentioned episodic surges in groundwater-fed rivers due to underground pressure equalization. I had to read it a few times to get it. Basically, sometimes water builds up in underground chambers until it forces its way out into the open through springs or riverbeds. Quietly, gradually, but with a lot of volume. Not violent, just rising. They measured water lines, changing several feet overnight in some parts of that valley. No downfall, no surface changes, just hidden pressure building up underground until it pushed out. The researchers said it was rare, but it happened. Mostly unnoticed unless someone was watching. That's what I saw. Not magic, not a ghost. Just water doing what water does best, finding a way out. But the part that still gets me is how quiet it was. No ruse, no warning, just slow, steady rise. If I'd stayed asleep, I don't know how far it would have come. Maybe it would have stopped, or maybe I would have woken up floating. Since then, I never camp next to a river without checking the geology first. And I never trust still water in the middle of the night. Not because it's evil, just because it moves when it wants to, and sometimes it doesn't care if you're watching. I have been camping solo for years, and I'd always preferred riverside spots. There's something calming about the sound of moving water, even at night. This trip was supposed to be just like the others. 3 days alone, no phone service, no people, just a tent, some simple food, and a fishing rod. I didn't pick this particular riverbank for any reason. It wasn't on any popular campsite app. I just saw it on the topographic map. A wide bend in the river with enough flat space beside it to pitch a tent. There was even an old forest access road that led close enough. I had to hike the last half mile, but that was normal. When I arrived, it looked perfect. The tree line pulled back just enough to make a flat clearing, probably about 30 feet across. The river curved wide here, pushing up against a rocky bank on the other side, but this side had soft gravel and dry earth. There were no signs of recent campers, no garbage, no carved trees. But there was one thing, a fire ring. Old, blackened stones laid out in a neat circle, sunken a little deeper than normal into the earth. The ring was maybe 3 feet wide, and it didn't look like it had been used recently. There was no fresh ash, no bits of burnt paper or plastic, just some charwood down deep, gray and quiet. I didn't think much of it. People camp all over, and I've found old fire rings in stranger places. Still, I decided not to use it. I like to build my own, and this one was set right in the middle of the clearing. I prefer my tent in the center, fire off to the side. So I set up camp, tent first, then dug a small pit on the outer edge of the clearing for my own fire. I collected dry branches and twigs from nearby. By sundown, I had a small flame going, and I made a simple dinner, just instant noodles with jerky chopped in. The fire was crackling. The sky was orange. The river was loud and steady. I felt good, but I kept glancing at the old fire ring. Something about it bothered me. It sat there like a scar, too symmetrical, too settled. I walked over after dinner and stood above it. The soil around it looked tampered with, like someone had tried to flatten it, press it down. There were no footprints, though. Nothing fresh. Still, it looked wrong. The ring wasn't just built, it was sunk. Most people pile rocks up to build a ring. This one looked like it had been dug down and then ringed. It was too low and too neat. That night, I stayed up later than usual. Not out of fear, not yet, but because something made me uneasy. I kept hearing small snaps from the trees. Normal forest sounds, sure, but they were close. Too close too often. At one point, I stood still with my back to the river, listening. It was almost like something was pacing just beyond the tree lean. Not a bear. Bears are clumsy loud. This was lighter, almost human, but not quite. Maybe deer, maybe raccoons. But I didn't see anything. I slept uneasily. Every sound woke me. The wind changed sometime after midnight, and I swear I could smell something faint but wrong, like metal and wet dirt. I tried to ignore it. At dawn, the smell was gone. The next day, I went fishing. I caught 2 small trout and cooked one for breakfast. I buried the scraps away from camp like always. I still hadn't touched the old fire ring, but I kept finding myself near it, poking the rocks with my boot or crouching beside it. Something about the way it was sunk in, it didn't seem like erosion. It looked dug, and when I pressed the toe of my boot into the ash, it gave way deeper than expected. Soft. By midday, I gave in. I got my small camp shovel and started clearing out the pit. At first, it was normal, just blackened ash, tiny bits of wood, a few stones that had cracked from heat. But as I dug deeper, things changed. The soil below the ash was looser, dark brown, almost black. Not the same color as the surrounding dirt. It was too rich, too churned. I kept digging. A few inches down, I hit something solid. At first, I thought it was just another rock, but it was flat. I brushed more dirt away, revealing a wide piece of charwood. Burnt on one side, but smooth and unmarked on the other. It wasn't natural. I pulled it up. It looked like part of a wooden plank, something from a crate or box. The edge was clean cut. I found another, then another. I pulled them out one by one. Beneath them, the dirt was even softer. A few more scoops, and I hit something else. Not wood this time. Cloth. I froze. It was deep gray, almost black. Tattered. I leaned in, heart thumping. I pulled gently, and a shredded piece of fabric came up. Smelled like mold and dirt. It looked like the sleeve of a coat. I stepped back. For a long time, I didn't move. My hands were filthy, my mouth dry. I didn't want to know more, but something kept me there. Curiosity or fear disguised as logic. I scraped more dirt out. That's when I saw it. A shoe. Not just a piece of one. A full shoe, half buried, the heel sticking out of the dirt. It was black leather, the laces frayed and mostly gone. I didn't touch it. My mind was running. This wasn't a lost shoe. It wasn't thrown or discarded. It was buried, under a fire ring, covered in wood and ash and stone. I sat back hard on the dirt. My breathing was too loud. The river seemed too quiet now, like it was listening. I stared at the shoe, then the rest of the pit. No bones, no flesh. What enough? A sleeve, planks, a shoe. Someone had been put here. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going. I packed my gear in my bag, keeping only the tent up. I sat with my back to a tree, facing the fire pit. Every few minutes, I swept my flashlight across the trees. Nothing moved, but I didn't feel alone. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the forest had noticed me. Sometime after midnight, I heard something soft, earth being disturbed, like someone walking barefoot across dry dirt. It was behind my tent. I moved slow, light in hand. I circled around, but saw nothing. Just the tent quiet and still. I stayed outside until morning. As soon as the sky lightened, I took down the tent and packed up everything. I didn't eat. I didn't brush my teeth. I just left. I followed the path back up to the forest road. The whole way, I felt like someone was behind me. Not close, just far enough to stay unseen. I kept turning, but there was never anything. When I got back to the car, I sat inside with the doors locked. I looked back down the path and knew I wasn't going to report it. Not yet. I didn't know what I'd found. There were no bones, no skull, no body, just pieces. But someone had used that fire pit to hide something. Something human. I drove straight home. No music, just the hum of tires and the echo of everything I'd uncovered. Over the next week, I did some quiet research. I searched missing persons in the area, looked at old newspaper articles. It took time, but eventually I found something. 8 years ago, a man in his 20s had gone missing near the same forest. He had been camping with friends at a different spot, then left alone after an argument. He was never seen again. His name was Marcus Dean. In one article, his family said he'd left wearing a black leather hiking shoe. The photo showed the pair, simple, black, with round laces. They matched. I never went back to the river. I wrote an anonymous letter to the state police with coordinates and a description. I didn't include my name. I didn't want attention. I just wanted it off my conscience. Weeks passed. No news stories. No follow-ups. But then, about a month later, a small article appeared buried in the local section of the paper. Human remains have been found by a fire pit on a remote bend of the river. Investigation ongoing. No suspects. No public statements from police. That was it. They found what I found. Someone had buried Marcus under a fire pit. And whoever did it had done it in a way to keep it hidden, under rocks and ash, in a place people rarely visited. But they hadn't buried him deep. They'd used him like fuel. They burned wood over him for cover. Maybe more than once. I never told anyone it was me who found him. But sometimes I dream of that shoe. Just the heel, poking up through the dirt like it was waiting to be noticed. And I wonder who knew. Who was out there, walking softly behind the trees. Who thought their secret was safe, even 8 years later. That fire pit wasn't old. It had been maintained. The stones were too clean. The ring too perfect. Someone came back, maybe often, to make sure it looked normal. Someone else had stood where I stood, watched those flames, slept beside the river, and maybe, just maybe, someone saw me that night too. I started the hike earlier than I usually would. The morning sky was still pale blue, and the mist hung low over the trees lining the river. I parked my car near a faded wooden sign that marked the entrance to the trail. Just a dirt pull-off beside a gravel road with weeds growing through the rocks. I packed light, a small pack with water bottles, a sandwich, first aid kit, headlamp, a thin rope, and my phone, which had no signal as soon as I turned off the highway an hour earlier. I wasn't worried. I had downloaded the topographic map of the trail ahead of time. It wasn't long, just a winding loop with a steep section that followed the side of the river where the terrain dropped sharply. I remember reading about it. People said the views were good if the trail wasn't too washed out. It had rained a few days ago, and I could still feel the dampness in the air. The dirt stuck slightly to my boots as I moved uphill. For the first hour, the trail was quiet. Not a single person passed me, and I didn't see anyone parked near the entrance either. The forest felt thick and green, and everything smelled like moss and wet bark. The trail narrowed as it climbed toward the high ridge above the river. I moved slowly, more to enjoy the quiet than anything else. I took a few pictures, nothing special, just trees and glimpses of the gray-blue water far below. By midday, the sun was fully out, and the warmth cut through the damp air. I followed the trail up toward a narrow ledge that wrapped around a scree slope, a steep pile of loose rock and gravel that ran down the side of the ridge toward the river below. The cliff here wasn't massive, maybe 40 or 50 feet high, but the slope underneath was a rough tumble of sharp stones and grit steep enough that losing your footing would carry you all the way to the base, maybe worse. I slowed down and tested each step as I moved along the ledge. The trail was barely more than a foot wide in places, hugging the rock face. Below it, the slope dropped away, covered in loose shale and dry pebbles. There was a stretch where the outer edge of the trail looked eroded. It had collapsed slightly, and the dirt looked fresh, like it hadn't fully settled yet. I stopped and studied it for a minute. Part of me thought about turning back, but I figured if I was careful and kept close to the inner edge, I'd be fine. I shifted my weight forward, hugging the side of the rock wall. My left foot touched a patch of sandy gravel. It held. I stepped again, this time placing more weight on my right leg, and as I did, the outer edge of the trail gave way. I felt the ground shift under my boot, an instant of sliding, then everything dropped. I didn't fall straight down. The trail collapsed in a slice under me, like a thin slab breaking off a loaf of bread. I landed hard on my side and immediately started sliding down the scree slope. The rocks moved like marbles under me, rolling and slipping out from beneath my body. I tried to dig in with my hands, but the stones just cut into my palms and kept sliding. My backpack scraped along the slope, and I could feel the straps pulling tight against my chest. I slid maybe 20 feet before I slammed against something solid, a half-buried boulder near the base of the slope. My shoulder hit it first, then my hip. The pain shot through me sharp and deep, like someone had driven a hammer into my side. Dust filled the air. I coughed and rolled to my back. The slope around me settled slowly, stones still clattering down beside me. I lay there for a while, staring up at the sky, trying to figure out what hurt and what didn't. My right arm was scraped and bleeding, but it moved fine. My left shoulder throbbed badly, and I couldn't lift it all the way. My left ankle was worse. It felt like it had folded under me during the fall. I reached down and touched it. Sharp pain made me stop. Swollen already. Not broken, maybe, but bad. I wouldn't be walking on it anytime soon. I pushed myself up to a sitting position and looked around. I was at the bottom of the slope, maybe 40 feet below where the trail had broken. The cliff wall above looked smooth, with barely any holds. The slope itself was too loose to climb back up without slipping again. To my left and right, the slope funneled into dense brush and boulders near the river's edge. The trail above had been my only safe path. Now it was gone. I checked my backpack. My phone was still inside, but there was no signal. I tried anyway, just in case. No bars. I put in airplane mode to save the battery. The sandwich was crushed, but I still had water and a small first aid kit. I cleaned the cuts on my arm with an alcohol pad and wrapped gauze around the deeper ones. I took a few sips of water and tried to think. I wasn't that far from the trailhead, maybe 3 or 4 miles, but I was off trail now, stuck between the river and the slope. The river itself was maybe 50 yards away, but thick bushes and uneven ground made it hard to tell how far I could actually go. I figured if I could make it to the riverbank, I might be able to follow it downstream. I had seen a footbridge near the parking area. If I could reach the river and follow it upstream, I might find it again. I tightened the straps on my backpack and used a thick stick I found nearby as a crutch. Every time I put weight on my ankle, it felt like a knife twisting under the skin. I tried to move slow, leaning on the stick, sliding my foot forward a few inches at a time. The slope leveled out near the bottom, but it was rough. Big stones jutted from the dirt, and the ground was soft in places where rain had collected. I could hear the river nearby, a steady, rushing sound, but the brush between me and the water was dense. I pushed my way through it, branches snagging on my clothes and backpack, leaves slapping my face. It felt like walking through a maze made of thorns and spiderwebs. I reached the riverbank after half an hour of pushing. My leg throbbed so badly, I had to sit again. The river was wide and fast-moving. Cold, gray water churned over rocks. The bank was narrow here, with a mix of soft mud and smooth stone. Across the river, I could see more forest and the slope rising again. No houses, no roads, just trees. I decided to rest for a while and think. It was still early afternoon. I had about 5 hours of daylight left. I couldn't go back up the slope. My best chance was to follow the river upstream and try to find a bridge or at least get close enough to the trail to call for help if I found signal. The next few hours were slow. The riverbank was uneven, and every step sent pain through my ankle. I moved inch by inch, resting often. At one point, I slipped and fell into the mud, coating my hands and arms. I sat there for 10 minutes, breathing heavy, staring at the water. It moved fast enough to carry someone away if they fell in. I stayed back after that. I didn't see any other people. No hikers, no boats, no sound except the river and the wind through the trees. At some point, I passed what looked like an old fire ring, just black stones and a few half-burned logs. It gave me hope. Someone had camped here before. That meant I was probably not too far from where people might go. As the sun dropped lower, the light turned gold, then dim. I hadn't made much progress, maybe a mile or two. My body ached. I found a flat patch of ground above the river and decided to stop for the night. I didn't have a tent, just a reflective emergency blanket and the clothes on my back. I laid out the blanket and wrapped myself in it, trying to stay warm. The night was rough. I couldn't sleep much. Every sound made me sit up, branches cracking, wind rustling leaves, insects buzzing. My ankle throbbed constantly. I kept thinking about what would happen if I didn't find help the next day. No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. That was my biggest mistake. At first light, I forced myself up. My ankle was stiff and swollen. I took a few sips of water and started again. The river bent sharply ahead, and around the curve, I saw something, wooden railings just barely visible through the trees. I hobbled forward as fast as I could, pushing through the brush, slipping once, and landing on my side. It was the bridge, old and narrow, with planks worn smooth by time and weather, but solid. The gravel trail curved up toward it. I almost cried when I saw it. I climbed up the embankment, dragging my bad leg behind me, and pulled myself onto the trail. From there, I knew the way. I followed the trail slowly back to the parking area. My car was still there. No one else had come. I opened the door and sat inside for a long time, just breathing. I checked my phone again, 2 bars now. I called for help. A ranger came out after an hour. They took me to the nearest clinic, and I got x-rays, antibiotics, crutches. The ankle was badly sprained. My shoulder had a deep bruise, but nothing broken. It took me a week to fully realize how lucky I was. If I had fallen farther, or hit my head, or broken something worse, no one would have known where to look. I had no signal and no one expecting me. I think about that slope every time I hike now. I see it clearly, the way the trail broke under me, the way the stones slid like water. I always tell someone where I'm going now. I don't go alone on sketchy trails. And I never, ever walk on ground that looks freshly eroded, no matter how stable it seems. I got out because I stayed calm, moved slow, and didn't push my luck. That's all it was. No miracle. I left the main trail just after noon. I'd been following the marked path for the better part of the morning, watching the lazy river wind its way through the trees off to my right. The campground was a few miles behind me, and I hadn't seen another person since I started. That's what I've been hoping for. Quiet, stillness, just me and the sound of water moving through rocks, birds darting across the canopy, and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. The river had always drawn me more than the trail itself. On maps, it looked like a ribbon stitched into the forest. I traced it the night before with my finger, imagining where it would narrow, where it would pool, where the current might carve little shelves into the earth. I want to find one of those places off the trail where no one else would go. Somewhere I could set up camp without hearing other people's radios or kids yelling or the scrape of metal coolers on gravel. I saw the false trail, maybe 15 minutes past the last wind marker. It looked real enough. Someone had clearly walked it before, and it curved gently down toward the river. It wasn't overgrown, and the grass was pushed down in a way that made it feel recent. I stopped and looked around. There were no signs or ropes or warnings. Just a smaller trail leading down through the trees, closer to the water. I hesitated for a second, but the pull of the river was stronger. I took a step down, then another. I remember the shift in air. On the main trail, the sun had been filtering through the trees, dappled and warm. But here it was denser. The trees crowded in more tightly. There was a smell, wet earth, moss, something sour underneath it. The kind of smell you notice, but don't question when you're outside for a while. The trail narrowed quickly, forcing me to turn my body slightly and walk in a single line. Ferns and vines pressed in on either side. The incline was subtle at first, then it dropped more sharply. My boots slipped a bit in the mud. I planted my hiking poles for balance, taking slow steps. I assumed it would level out soon, maybe meet the river at some bend. I could already hear it louder, less of a trickle and more of a deep rush. Maybe there was a fall ahead or a sudden drop in the terrain. I didn't mind. I liked when the land surprised me. After another 10 minutes of careful stepping, I found what looked like a clearing. Not open, really, but more spaced out. The trail ended at a slope, steep, worn down, leading directly to the edge of the riverbank. There was no ledge or beach. The slope just fell into the water. Sharp rocks jutted out along the sides, slick and dark with moss. The river here was fast, louder than I'd expected. It churned against the rocks in white foam and pulled hard toward a bend I couldn't see past. I stood at the top of that slope and realized I'd followed a runoff path. It wasn't a trail at all. It had been carved by water, maybe during spring when the snow melted or during heavy storms. That's why it looked so recently used. The water had worn it down, not people. I'd followed erosion. I should have turned back then. I should have climbed back up to the main trail and found a better place. But I didn't. I don't know if it was stubbornness or curiosity. Maybe both. I dropped my pack and crouched low, trying to see if there was any safe way to climb down closer to the river without slipping. I saw what looked like a natural step, a flat rock shelf maybe 6 feet below the edge. If I could reach that, I could follow the rocks a little further downstream and maybe find a safer spot to sit and rest. I tied off my pack to a tree root, looped the strap over my shoulder, and began lowering myself down. The mud was softer than I thought. My boots sank halfway into it, and I lost balance for a second. I caught myself on a root jutting from the wall and paused to steady my breath. It was stupid, I knew that. I wasn't a climber. I didn't even have gloves. But the step was close, and I made it. The rock was cold under my boots. It was slick with river spray and mossy in patches, but it held my weight. From here, I could see the water more clearly. It was deeper than I expected, dark green, almost black in parts, with bits of foam spinning along the edges. There were more rock shelves further along, each one a little lower than the last, almost like stairs made by nature. They curved slightly with the bend of the river. I started walking sideways along the rocks, placing each foot slowly, testing them before shifting my weight. My fingers scraped against the wall to my left for balance, brushing over wet moss and broken bark. There was no real path, just narrow footholds and short ledges that rose and fell unpredictably. I reached a wider rock shelf after maybe 20 minutes. It jutted out slightly over the river like a natural ledge, flat and open enough to sit. It looked perfect, the kind of place you imagine finding when you wander off the trail. I dropped my pack and sat, pulling out a protein bar and my water bottle. I looked around. No other people, no sound except the river and the occasional bird. It felt isolated, peaceful even, until I heard the first crack. It was faint at first, like a branch snapping far off in the woods behind me. I didn't think much of it. Forests make noises. Animals move. Trees settle. But then it happened again, louder and closer. A second crack, followed by a shifting sound, like something sliding against stone. I stood up and looked toward the path I'd come down. The ledges behind me were empty. No animals, no people. Just the same rock shelves and moss-covered walls. I waited for another sound, but it didn't come. That's when I noticed the water level. The rock I was standing on had been dry when I arrived, but now the edges were wet. A thin layer of water was beginning to push over it, foaming gently and swirling toward the edge. I looked upstream and saw it, more water. The river had risen subtly but steadily in the last half hour. I hadn't noticed it while sitting. Panic bloomed in my chest. If the water kept rising, those narrow shelves I'd walked across would be underwater soon. They were already slick and hard to cross dry. Wet, they'd be almost impossible. I grabbed my pack and turned, walking quickly back along the ledge. but the river had already claimed part of the path. The second shelf, the one I'd used to get down, was covered in a thin stream of water. Just a few inches, but enough to make it dangerous. I crouched and tried to test the grip of my boots on the wet stone. No good. My heel slipped immediately. If I tried to walk it, I'd fall. And there was no guardrail or soft landing. Just jagged rocks and fast-moving water. I looked up at the slope I'd climbed down. Too steep to scale from here. The mud was already giving way in parts, crumbling in wet chunks and sliding into the river. I wasn't trapped, not yet, but I was boxed in. I had one option: to wait. If the water rose slowly, maybe it would stop. Maybe this was just a temporary surge, a release from upstream, or a shift in current. I had food. I had water. I could wait out, then climb back when it was safer. I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The light began to shift. The sun filtered lower through the trees, casting long shadows across the river. The temperature dropped. I put on my jacket and tried to stay calm. I checked my phone. No signal. I tried walking the edge of the rock, seeing if there was a better place to climb or maybe another trail leading up. Nothing. Just more rock and more river. I heard another crack. This one wasn't from the woods. It came from a slope above. A long, groaning sound, followed by a sudden rush of debris. A chunk of the upper trail had collapsed. Mud, roots, and small rocks tumbling down the path I'd used. I watched as it hit the edge of the rock shelf and spilled into the river, vanishing beneath the foam. I knew then that getting back the way I came wasn't going to happen. The slope was gone. Even if the water dropped, the path was ruined. I thought about staying overnight, maybe building a signal or a fire. But the sun dipped lower, and I realized the air was thick with moisture. Everything was damp. No dry twigs, no dry leaves. My lighter sparked, but the flame died quickly. The rocks were too slick, too exposed. I wouldn't last the night comfortably. That's when I noticed the current had shifted direction, subtly, but definitely. Debris floated back toward the slope instead of away. The river had reversed. I didn't understand it at first. Then I remembered the topographic maps. There was a man-made dam miles upstream. If they closed the gates, the river would pool. When they opened them again, it would rush down in a surge. Maybe they'd closed it earlier and now opened it again, causing the river to swell quickly. I hadn't checked for scheduled releases. I'd been careless. I had to move. I took off my boots and socks, tied them to my pack, and stepped into the water barefoot, using my toes for grip. The rock shelves ahead were barely visible now, just dark shapes under the surface. I stepped cautiously, feeling each one before shifting my weight. The water was ice cold, numbing my feet instantly. The current wasn't deep, but it was strong enough to pull on my legs. I crouched low, keeping balance with my hands on the rock wall beside me. Every step was a risk. The moss under the water was slippery, and once I slipped, my foot shot forward, and I didn't think the river would rise. That was my first mistake. It had rained a bit the night before I got there, but the weather was supposed to hold. I checked the forecast before leaving, and there was nothing serious showing. Just a chance of drizzle, maybe a bit of wind. Nothing to worry about. I had picked that spot carefully too, a flat bend in the river surrounded by sloping banks and trees. It was a wide loop with soft ground and a clear patch not far from the water. I liked it because it felt private and the tree line behind it made it feel tucked away. It was one of those places that didn't look like much on the map, but when you saw it in person, it felt like a little hidden pocket of quiet. I hiked in from the east side. The trail wasn't marked, but it was obvious enough. A narrow dirt path cutting through brush and roots, following a dry ridge line before sloping down toward the bend. I remember it took maybe 2 hours of walking, not counting breaks. The final stretch went down a loose dirt slope and ended in tall grass. From there I could see the river bend, opening up like a bowl, and the water was low, maybe 10 or 15 feet from where I set up camp. You could see the dry edge where the river usually sat during wetter seasons, but it wasn't even close to full. I set up my tent just past the gravel, maybe 30 feet from the edge of the river. The ground was soft but not muddy, and there were no signs of water reaching that high in a long time. My boots didn't sink much when I walked, and the tree roots in the area weren't waterlogged. I took that as a good sign. It was a good day. I boiled some instant coffee, ate a packet of noodles, and read for a while. There was no signal, which was the point. I wanted to be somewhere I could be alone and not feel rushed. I was tired of work, tired of screens, and I just wanted to hear water and wind. That's all. And for a while, it gave me exactly that. That night, the rain started again. It was soft at first, just a patter against the nylon roof of my tent. I was already in my sleeping bag, zipped up, trying to drift off. I didn't think much of it, just a summer shower, nothing heavy. The kind of rain that made you sleep better. I actually liked the sound. It didn't get strong until later, maybe around midnight. I remember waking up once to the sound of it pounding harder than before, and I checked my phone for the time. No bars, just 12:43 a.m. and a blinking battery icon. I had about 40% left. I didn't bother checking the weather again. The rain had been going steady, but I figured it would pass. I pulled the sleeping bag up tighter and fell back asleep. I don't know what time I woke up next. It was early, maybe just past dawn, but the tent felt cold and damp. The air had that wet smell, and my sleeping bag had soaked up some moisture along the sides. I sat up and listened. The river was louder. That's what I noticed first. The soft running sound from the day before was now something deeper. Heavier. It sounded like someone had opened a dam upstream. I rubbed my face, zipped open the flap, and stepped out. The water was closer. Much closer. The river had crept up maybe 20 feet since the night before. It was now only 10 or so feet from my tent, and it was muddy, swirling fast. The color had changed. It was no longer that clear greenish blue. It was brown and heavy, full of churned up sediment and foam. Logs and branches floated in it, some spinning and bumping against the bend. I stood there barefoot, staring, listening. Something didn't feel right. I walked up the rise toward the trail I had come down. It was a steep slope that curved around to the east, and it should have led me back toward the ridge. But something had changed. Where the slope had been solid ground the day before, now it was torn open. A chunk of it had collapsed during the night. The roots were exposed like ribs, and thick, wet earth had spilled down into a heap at the bottom. The trail was still there in pieces, but the slope was so unstable I didn't trust climbing it. I tested it anyway, my boots sinking deep with each step, but the dirt slid under me like wet clay. One step up, half a step slid back down. I tried holding on to roots, but even those pulled free with enough weight. I tried maybe 5 or 6 steps before I gave up. I wasn't going to make it up like that. And if I slipped, I'd go down hard and probably twist something or worse. So I went back down to the tent, thinking I'd wait it out. Maybe the water would go down again once the rain let up. It had stopped raining, after all. The sky looked brighter through the trees, and the air felt less heavy. I figured it was just a temporary flood from runoff somewhere upstream. But the water kept rising. By noon, it was licking the fire pit I had used the night before. My tent was now barely 5 feet from the edge. The soft ground beneath, it was starting to sag and hold puddles. I moved my gear, sleeping bag, stove, dry food, up toward the tree line. There was a narrow path along the back of the bend that hugged the inside of the curve, but it wasn't really a trail. Just a strip of clear ground under trees, sloping sharply up to thick brush. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes, trying to find another exit. But both ends of the bend were now thick with water. The whole curve of the river had changed overnight. What had once been a wide arc with a slow current was now a deep channel hugging the inside of the bend like a claw. The outside of the curve was higher ground, dry, but unreachable. I was on the wrong side. I remember thinking, it's just water. It'll go back down. I waited. By evening, the water was up to where my tent had been. I'd already dragged it back and propped it awkwardly between some trees, but everything was damp. The gear, the clothes, even the inside of the bag had taken in moisture. My feet were pruned and cold. I tried starting a fire, but the wood was too wet. Even the dry tinder I had packed was soft from the air. I chewed some granola, sipped the last of my bottled water, and tried to think. I couldn't call for help. No service. No satellite messenger. No radio. I had brought a small flashlight, a knife, and a compass, but nothing that would help in this situation. I started to realize how careless I had been. I had come out alone, told no one exactly where I'd be, and assumed I could just walk back the way I came. That kind of thinking felt stupid now. I spent that night curled in my damp sleeping bag, listening to the river tear past louder than before. Something big floated by in the dark, a whole log maybe, or even a dead tree, but I couldn't see clearly. I just heard it thudding along the bend, hitting rocks, scraping past with that deep, hollow sound would make some water. It was hard to sleep with that sound in your ears. The next morning, the sun came out. I took that as a good sign. The water was still high, but it didn't seem to have risen much more. I used a dry patch of tarp to wipe out my boots, then started hiking again along the back edge of the bend. I figured if I followed the water's edge far enough, I might find a spot shallow enough to cross, or a tree that had fallen over. But the farther I walked, the steeper the outer bank became. It wasn't just the bend anymore, it was the whole river on that side. The opposite shore had tall slopes, muddy rock faces, and no visible breaks. And the inner side where I stood just kept narrowing, pinched by the swollen water and brush. Eventually, I came to a point where the trees were too thick and the water too close. No way through, no way over. I sat down and listened. I could hear planes faint and far off, but I had no way of signaling them. No fire, no flares, no bright clothing laid out in a pattern. Just a damp tent under trees and a muddy bend where one hiker had disappeared behind a wall of water. That night was worse. My stomach was empty. I'd eaten my last real meal, dried noodles cold by mid-afternoon. I had maybe half a protein bar left, and the rest was crushed or wet. I tried collecting rainwater by tying up my tarp between trees and letting droplets run into my cup, but it wasn't much. The air was still, humid, full of insects. The sound of the river kept rushing in my ears like it was trying to drown out everything else. That's when I noticed something new. The water wasn't just high, it was cutting, eating into the inner bend. Each hour, more of the ground gave way. Roots snapped, soil slipped. Even the tree closest to my first tent site started to tilt. It hit me then, really hit me, that the river was still moving, still changing. It wasn't just a flood holding steady. It was carving through the inside of the bend, peeling it apart piece by piece. The shape of the land was changing. I couldn't wait anymore. The next morning I packed what I could carry: knife, compass, the last bit of food, flashlight, tarp, and started moving up, away from the river. No trail, just thick brush, slopes, loose earth. I figured if I could reach higher ground, I'd have better odds. I could find another ridge or a place with signal. Anything. I used my compass to orient northeast, the direction I had come from originally, and forced my way uphill. It was slow, exhausting. Branches tore my clothes. Thorns ripped skin. My boots slipped in the mud. I crawled on all fours at some points, just trying to get leverage. Then I heard it, a rumble. Not thunder, not wind. Something collapsed behind me. I turned and saw part of the inner bend cave in. A section of earth, maybe 20 feet wide, slid into the river like it had never been there. Just gone, trees and all. The river swallowed it without slowing down. I kept moving. It took most of the day, but I found a ridge. It wasn't high, but it was